Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and am here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. The night this story takes place was in late autumn. You know the kind. The air feels sharp, crisp, and every step you take crunches against scattered leaves. My name's Caleb, and at the time, I was just a regular guy trying to juggle school and part-time work. I'd picked up a delivery gig to help pay off some bills, and although I wouldn't call myself a thrill seeker, there was something about late-night drives that always appealed to me. The roads are empty, the airwaves are quiet, and there's this strange sense of freedom that comes with being alone with your thoughts. It was a Friday night, the kind where most people are out with friends or winding down from the week. For me, though, it was a shift like any other. I lived in a small town nestled between endless stretches of woods and hills, where GPS was both a blessing and a curse. Most roads in the area looked the same, and it wasn't uncommon to end up at a dead end or find yourself navigating down a forgotten dirt path. Still, I had grown familiar with the quirks of the job. That evening, the town was unusually quiet. My route began at a local cafe where I grabbed an order for delivery. The scent of coffee and fresh pastries still clung to the air as I got into my car. My car, a beat-up but reliable sedan, had been with me for years. Its dashboard was littered with loose change, crumpled receipts, and an old air freshener shaped like a tree. Nothing glamorous, but it got the job done. I tapped on the GPS to enter the delivery address, watching as the map flickered to life. It was supposed to be a relatively quick run, just a few miles out of town. I didn't pay much attention to the exact destination, other than the fact that it seemed to lead toward the outskirts. The first part of the drive was uneventful. Streetlights cast long, golden beams onto the road, and storefronts glowed faintly in the distance. I turned on the radio to fill the silence, but all I got was static. No surprise there. Reception was always spotty out here. I settled for the hum of the engine and the occasional thud of my tires rolling over uneven asphalt. As I drove further, the town began to fade behind me. Houses became more spaced out, replaced by stretches of trees and shadowy hills. I wasn't concerned at first. This wasn't my first time delivering to a remote area. But there was something about the stillness of that night that felt heavier. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches silhouetted against the dim light of a crescent moon. Every so often, I glanced at the GPS, watching the little arrow inch along a winding road. The address took me onto a side street that quickly turned into a gravel path. I frowned, double-checking the route. The GPS assured me I was on track, though the surroundings didn't seem promising. On either side of the path, dense woods stretched into darkness, their outlines barely visible beyond the reach of my headlights. I rolled down the window slightly, letting in the cold night air. It smelled earthy and damp, with a faint hint of smoke, though I couldn't see any signs of a fire. I reminded myself it was just a job. People lived all over the place out here, and it wasn't unusual to deliver to someone's cabin or a house tucked away in the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. After another 10 minutes of driving, I reached a fork in the road. The GPS instructed me to take the left path, which looked narrower and less maintained than the right. Gravel turned into packed dirt, and potholes jostled the car as I followed the directions. My headlights illuminated a tunnel of trees ahead, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. There were no signs of houses, no mailboxes or porch lights. Just trees and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. GPS's voice interrupted the silence, its monotone directions sounding louder than usual. In 500 feet, your destination will be on the left. I glanced at the screen. It still showed the little arrow progressing toward the end of the route, though there was no visible sign of a house or driveway. I slowed down, scanning the surroundings. The dirt road widened slightly, leading to a small clearing. It was empty except for a weathered wooden sign that was too faded to read. In 200 feet, your destination will be on the left, the GPS announced again, its voice now grating against the growing unease in my chest. I pulled into the clearing and stopped the car, and that's where it began. The clearing where I had stopped my car was eerily quiet. There were no signs of life, no houses, no streetlights, not even the distant hum of insects that usually came with the woods. Just silence. My GPS chirped again, breaking the stillness. You have arrived at your destination. I stared at the screen, waiting for some correction, some update to tell me it made a wrong turn. But the little arrow was planted firmly on the endpoint. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, hoping to spot something, a driveway, a mailbox, anything. The beam of my headlights illuminated the trees, their trunks weathered and gnarled, and the dirt path that seemed to lead nowhere. Reaching for my phone, I decided to check the delivery app for more details. Maybe the customer had left instructions or a note explaining the odd location. But the app wouldn't load. The spinning wheel on the screen mocked me, and I realized my phone was struggling to find a signal. I raised it higher, tilting it toward the windshield, as though an extra inch closer to the sky would make a difference. Still nothing. A low sigh escaped my lips as I set the phone down on the passenger seat. Great, I muttered to myself. I rolled the window down further, leaning out slightly to get a better look around. The cold air prickled my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth. It felt heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. That's when I noticed it, the first strange thing. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my headlights, there was something standing between the trees. A figure! I blinked, my eyes straining to adjust. It wasn't moving, but it was definitely there, a dark, upright shape against the lighter backdrop of the forest. My immediate thought was that it must be a tree trunk or a shadow, distorted by my headlights. But as I stared, the shape began to take on a more distinct form. It wasn't a tree. It looked like a person. My chest tightened, and I instinctively locked the car doors. Hello? I called out, my voice cracking slightly. There was no response. The figure didn't move. Seconds felt like minutes as I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just someone out for a walk or a hunter passing through. People lived all kinds of lives out here. It wasn't my place to judge. But then, why were they just standing there, not moving or responding? I turned my high beams on, flooding the clearing with light. The figure disappeared. My heart skipped a beat. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. I leaned forward, scanning the trees again. Maybe it imagined it. Maybe it was just a shadow cast by the trees swaying in the breeze. But the trees weren't swaying. The air was completely still. A sudden rustling sound came from behind the car, snapping me out of my thoughts. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise wasn't loud, but in the oppressive silence of the clearing, it might as well have been a gunshot. I stared out the rear window, but all I could see was darkness. My taillights cast a faint red glow onto the dirt road behind me, but it wasn't enough to reveal anything beyond a few feet. I reached for the handle to roll the window up, but stopped myself. What if I needed to hear something else? Another rustle, this time closer. My breath hitched as I grabbed my phone again, praying the flashlight app would work, even if I didn't have a signal. Thankfully, it did. I pointed the beam out the driver's side window, scanning the edge of the clearing. My hand was shaking, the light bouncing erratically as I searched for the source of the sound. And then I saw it. A hand! It was gripping the edge of a tree trunk, pale and thin, with fingers that looked unnaturally long. It disappeared as quickly as I spotted it, retreating behind the tree like a crab scuttling out of sight. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in as a wave of panic washed over me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a weird delivery to a remote location. Something was wrong. I fumbled with the gear shift, throwing the car into reverse. My tires spun in the dirt for a moment before catching, and the car lurched backward. I didn't care if the delivery wasn't completed or if I got a bad review. I wasn't about to stick around and find out who or what was in those woods. As I backed out of the clearing, my headlights caught movement in the trees. A flicker of motion, too fast to make out clearly. My foot pressed harder on the gas, and I turned the car around, heading back the way it'd come. The GPS recalculated, its voice breaking the silence. Rerouting. I almost laughed at how casual it sounded, as though it hadn't just led me to what felt like a scene out of a horror movie. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The dirt path seemed darker now, the trees closing in on either side. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the hand had been a trick of the light. Maybe the figure in the clearing had been nothing more than a tree stump, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how many excuses I came up with, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I reached the fork in the road, the GPS spoke again. In 500 feet, make a U-turn. No way, I muttered, glancing at the screen. The route had changed again, pointing me back toward the clearing. My stomach sank as I realized something else. The map was glitching. The little arrow was spinning in place, unable to decide which direction I was facing. I slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the path. The last thing I needed was to get lost out here. I grabbed my phone, trying once more to pull up a map. Still no signal. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. They were faint, barely audible over the hum of the engine, but they were there, steady and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind the car. I froze, my grip tightening on the phone. Slowly, I reached for the window switch, rolling it up as quietly as I could. My pulse was hammering in my ears, drowning out everything else. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just silence. I leaned forward, peering into the rearview mirror, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. And then, something slammed against the back of the car. The loud thud against the back of the car jolted me forward, my chest tightening with a mix of fear and adrenaline. My first instinct was to hit the gas and speed out of there, but my hand froze on the gear shift. What if whatever or whoever was out there had already moved in front of the car? My headlights cast their unwavering beams onto the dirt road ahead, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see something or someone standing behind the car. But there was only darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps as I struggled to think. I couldn't just sit there. If something was trying to get in, I needed to act. Summoning what little courage I had left, I turned in my seat and shined my phone's flashlight through the rear windshield. The weak beam barely pierced the night, but it was enough to make out the faint outline of something smeared across the glass. A handprint. It was long and smudged, almost claw-like, as if the hand had dragged across the surface. My stomach churned at the sight, and I instinctively reached for the door locks again, making sure they were engaged. I whispered to myself, "This isn't happening." A sudden movement to my left caught my attention. Something darted past the edge of my vision, too quick to identify. I whipped my head around, pointing the flashlight toward the side window. The beam flickered slightly as my trembling hand struggled to keep it steady. The trees swayed gently in the cold breeze, their branches casting distorted shadows on the dirt. But just beyond them, deeper in the woods, I saw something, or thought I did. A pale, humanoid figure standing motionless between the trunks. My throat went dry, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. It didn't move. It didn't flinch. It just stood there, almost blending in with the bark of the trees. I squinted, trying to make sense of its shape, but the flashlight wasn't strong enough to give me any clear details. Then, without warning, it turned its head. I don't know how to describe what I saw in that moment. Its face, or what should have been a face, seemed wrong, like it didn't belong. The features were twisted, as if someone had tried to carve a human likeness out of wood and failed. Its head tilted slightly, and even from the distance, I could feel its gaze locked on me. I yanked the flashlight back into the car and started the engine. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the gear shift, but I managed to put the car into drive. I didn't care about the GPS or the delivery anymore. I just wanted to get away. As the car lurched forward, something scraped against the passenger side window. I screamed, jerking the wheel to the left and nearly driving off the path. The sound was high-pitched and metallic, like nails on glass. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at the windows. Whatever was out there wanted me to stop, and I wasn't about to give it the satisfaction. The Jeep spoke again, its robotic voice eerily calm. "Make a U-turn in 200 feet. "No," I muttered, my voice trembling. "Not a chance." But the road ahead was narrowing, the trees pressing closer together. The path seemed different now, as if it had shifted somehow. I didn't remember it being this tight on the way in. The low-hanging branches scratched against the roof of the car, creating a sound that made my skin crawl. I reached a fork in the path, but the GPS was useless. It had stopped updating entirely, leaving me to choose blindly. I hesitated for a moment before taking the left turn, hoping it would lead me back to the main road. The car jolted as the wheels hit a series of deep ruts in the dirt, and the whole vehicle shuddered. I gripped the wheel tightly, fighting to keep control. The shadows outside seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if the forest itself was closing in. And then, just when I thought I was putting some distance between myself and whatever was out there, the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I whispered, pressing harder on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward briefly before slowing again. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine made a sound like it was choking. I pulled over, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. The engine gave one last wheeze before falling silent. The headlights dimmed, leaving me in near total darkness. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. My phone's flashlight was my only source of light now, and the battery was draining fast. I reached for the glove compartment, fumbling for the small emergency flashlight I kept there. My hands shook as I turned it on, the beam casting a faint yellow glow across the interior of the car. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to assess the situation. The car wouldn't start, the GPS was useless, and I was in the middle of nowhere. The logical thing to do would be to stay put and wait for daylight, or for someone to come looking for me. But something about the oppressive silence of the forest told me that staying here wasn't an option. I shined the flashlight out the driver's side window, scanning the edge of the path. The woods were unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals conspicuously absent. My skin prickled as I realized that the silence wasn't natural. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A faint rustling sound came from somewhere ahead, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was distant at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But it was getting louder. The sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. I turned off the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My breathing was shallow as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching softly against the dirt path. They stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from the direction I had come, I heard another sound. A low, guttural growl. The low growl reverberated through the oppressive silence, freezing me in place. It wasn't the sound of a typical animal. There was an edge to it that seemed almost unnatural, as though it came from something that wasn't supposed to exist. My chest tightened, and every instinct screamed for me to stay hidden, to stay silent. But then the footsteps started again, louder this time. They were closer, deliberate, and accompanied by the faint sound of something dragging. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that the rough texture imprinted on my skin. Sweat trickled down my temple as I pressed myself as far back into the seat as I could. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was a stray animal. disoriented in the dark. Or perhaps someone else had taken the wrong turn and ended up on this forsaken road. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the faint moonlight, streaming through the trees. My pulse raced as I caught a glimpse of a figure standing just beyond the edge of the path, partially obscured by the dense foliage. It was tall, too tall, and its posture was hunched, almost predatory. The flashlight in my hand felt useless. I didn't dare turn it on again, fearing it would reveal my exact location. Instead, I sat in the darkness, every muscle in my body tense, listening to the sounds around me. The dragging noise grew louder, accompanied by the distinct crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. I could feel it getting closer, the air in the car growing heavier with each passing second. And then, without warning, the figure stepped onto the path, fully illuminated by the faint moonlight. It wasn't human. Its body was thin and angular, its limbs unnaturally long. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched tightly over its bones. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if they could even be called that, were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it slowly turn its head, scanning the area. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if it were unfamiliar with its own body. And then, it stopped. It was looking directly at me. A wave of cold washed over me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body refused to cooperate. The creature took a step closer, its long, spindly legs bending in unnatural ways. Panic set in, and I fumbled for the keys in the ignition, desperately trying to start the car. The engine sputtered weakly, but didn't catch. The sound seemed to agitate the creature. It let out a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It moved closer, now only a few feet from the driver's side window. I could see its face more clearly now, and the sight was something I knew I would never forget. Its features were distorted, as though someone had taken a human face and twisted it into something grotesque. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth that glinted in the dim light. The creature raised one long, bony arm and pressed its hand against the window. The glass groaned under the pressure, tiny cracks spidering out from where its fingers pressed. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I scrambled to unlock my phone, desperate to call for help. The screen lit up, casting a small glow inside the car. The creature's head snapped toward the light, and it let out an ear-piercing screech that seemed to shake the entire vehicle. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the emergency flashlight from the passenger seat and turned it on, shining the beam directly into the creature's face. It recoiled instantly, letting out a guttural growl as it stumbled backward, shielding its eyes. Taking advantage of the moment, I flung open the door on the passenger side and bolted out of the car. My legs felt like jelly as I sprinted down the path, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The forest around me was a blur of shadows and twisted branches, but I didn't dare stop to look back. Behind me, I could hear the creature's guttural screeches and the sound of it crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, far faster than I had anticipated. My lungs burned as I pushed myself to run faster, weaving through the trees in a desperate attempt to lose it. The path disappeared, and I found myself stumbling through uneven terrain, tripping over roots and rocks. The flashlight flickered, the battery nearly dead, and I cursed under my breath. I couldn't afford to lose my only source of light. The screeches grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right on top of me. I turned sharply, ducking behind a large tree and turning off the flashlight. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the cold night air burning my lungs. For a moment, there was silence. I pressed my back against the rough bark of the tree, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. And then I heard it. The sound of something sniffing, low and guttural, like an animal searching for prey. It was close, too close. My stomach churned as I realized it was circling me, moving slowly but deliberately. I gripped the flashlight tightly, ready to use it as a weapon if I had to. The sniffing grew louder, and I could hear the crunch of leaves just on the other side of the tree. Suddenly, a pale hand shot out from around the trunk, its long fingers grasping wildly. I screamed and swung the flashlight as hard as I could, connecting with something solid. The creature let out a deafening screech and recoiled, giving me just enough time to dart out from behind the tree. I ran blindly, the flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline, every instinct focused on survival. The sounds of pursuit were deafening, the creature crashing through the forest like a force of nature. Ahead, I saw a faint light, a break in the trees that led to an open field. Summoning every ounce of strength, I sprinted toward it, the cold air stinging my face. As I burst into the clearing, the creature stopped at the edge of the woods. Its distorted form was barely visible in the shadows, but its presence was unmistakable. It let out one final, guttural screech before retreating into the darkness, leaving me alone in the eerie silence of the night. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring into the dark woods, half expecting the creature to reappear. But it didn't. The field was silent, save for the faint rustling of the wind through the grass. My flashlight finally gave out, plunging me into darkness, but I didn't care. I was alive, and for now, that was enough. I sat in the middle of the clearing for what felt like hours, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. My body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the lingering adrenaline that coursed through me. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night in an endless loop. The creature's distorted face, its guttural screeches, and the way it moved with terrifying precision were etched into my memory. I wasn't safe here, not yet. The clearing offered temporary relief, but the forest loomed around me, dark and foreboding, a constant reminder that the nightmare wasn't over. I needed to get to safety. But where? My phone was useless. The GPS had long since stopped working, and I had no idea how far it strayed from the main road. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky and unsteady. The flashlight had given up, but the faint glow of the moon provided just enough light to see a vague path ahead. My only choice was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the creature. The field stretched out before me, leading to what appeared to be a dirt road at the far end. It wasn't much, but it was something, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. I started walking, each step a battle against the exhaustion that weighed me down. My breathing was shallow, my thoughts fragmented, but I pushed forward, driven by a primal need to survive. The road was uneven, littered with stones and patches of mud. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving only the faint sound of my footsteps echoing in the night. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, my heart skipping a beat at every shadow that seemed to shift or move. My paranoia was justified. I had seen what was out there, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Eventually, the road led to a small, dilapidated structure. It was an old shed, its wooden walls warped and weathered by time. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were cracked, allowing faint moonlight to filter through. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter. I hesitated at the entrance, my instincts warning me to stay outside. But the thought of being exposed in the open was worse. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the shed was empty, save for a few rusted tools and broken furniture. The air was musty, thick with the scent of decay. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, using a piece of wood to prop it shut. It wasn't much, but it was the best I could do. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, my back to the door. The exhaustion hit me all at once, my body finally succumbing to the toll of the night. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite the fear that lingered in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop myself from drifting off. I woke with a start, my heart racing as I struggled to remember where I was. The shed was dark, the faint glow of dawn barely visible through the cracked windows. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like the crunch of gravel underfoot. Panic surged through me as I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside. My breath caught in my throat, and I clenched my fists, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. The door rattled, the wood groaning under the weight of something pressing against it. I held my breath, my entire body tense as I waited for it to break through. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure disappeared. The silence was deafening, every second stretching into an eternity. I didn't move, afraid that even the slightest sound would give away my presence. And then I heard footsteps, retreating, fading into the distance. I stayed in the shed until the sun was fully up, the light flooding the room and chasing away the shadows. Only then did I gather the courage to open the door and step outside. The clearing was empty, the road stretching out before me in both directions. There was no sign of the creature, no evidence of its presence, save for the claw marks etched into the shed's door. I didn't waste any time. I followed the road, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. My legs ached, my body sore from the night's ordeal, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. After what felt like hours, I finally saw it, a gas station at the edge of the road. It was small and rundown, but to me, it was a beacon of hope. I stumbled inside, my appearance drawing concerned looks from the clerk. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I even begin to explain what had happened? Instead, I shook my head and muttered something about needing to make a call. He handed me a phone, and I dialed the only number I could think of, a friend who lived nearby. When they arrived, their face was a mixture of relief and confusion. "What happened to you?" they asked, their voice tinged with disbelief. I hesitated, my mind racing as I tried to find the right words. "I got lost," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. I took a wrong turn. It wasn't the full truth, but it was all I could manage. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memories of that night. The creature's face haunted my dreams, its guttural screeches echoing in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But the claw marks on the shed's door were real. I never went back to that area, never tried to retrace my steps or figure out where the GPS had led me. Some things are better left unexplored, better left unanswered. Even now, when I'm driving at night, I feel a pang of unease every time the GPS recalculates. The thought of ending up on another deserted road, of encountering that creature again, is enough to make my blood run cold. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some paths should never be taken. And sometimes the safest choice is to turn around and go back the way you came. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. Even when I was safe at home, surrounded by the comforts of familiarity, I felt the weight of what I had experienced pressing down on me. It wasn't something I could explain away or rationalize. The marks on the shed's door, the twisted face of the creature, and the oppressive silence of that forest were all too vivid to dismiss. I spent countless hours replaying that night in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was it some sort of territorial animal, distorted by the shadows and my fear? Was it something not meant to be understood, a creature that existed on the fringes of reality, where logic and reason failed? No answer brought me any real peace. What I knew for certain was that the world isn't as simple as we like to believe. There are places out there where the rules don't seem to apply, where the darkness feels alive, and where something ancient and unknowable lurks just out of sight. That forest, that night, was one of those places. For a while, I thought about warning others. I considered writing an article, posting my story online, or even reporting it to someone who might investigate. but every time I sat down to do it, the words escaped me. How could I describe something so incomprehensible without sounding like it lost my mind? In the end, I decided against it. The fewer people who knew about that place, the better. I did make one change though. I stopped relying on GPS entirely. It seemed like a small, insignificant act, but it was my way of regaining control, of ensuring I never ended up in a situation like that again. I went back to using physical maps, plotting my routes carefully before heading out. It was inconvenient, sure, but the peace of mind it brought was worth it. Every time I drive at night, especially on empty roads, I can't help but glance at the shadows, half expecting to see something moving just out of sight. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig makes my heart race, and every faint glow of a streetlight feels like a fragile sanctuary against the encroaching dark. I've tried to move on, to push the memories of that night to the back of my mind. Most days, I succeed. I go to work, spend time with friends, and try to focus on the mundane aspects of life. But there are moments, quiet, still moments, when it all comes rushing back. Sometimes, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the creature's guttural screeches still echoing in my ears. Other times, I'll catch myself staring out the window, watching the darkness with a sense of dread I can't quite explain. And then there are the dreams. They don't come often, but when they do, they leave me shaken for days. In them, I'm back on that road, the gibbous leading me deeper and deeper into the forest. No matter how hard I try to turn back, I can't escape. The creature is always there, watching, waiting. I don't know if the dreams are just my mind's way of processing the trauma, or if there's something more. A warning, perhaps, or a reminder that the creature is still out there. Either way, they've taught me one thing. Some experiences leave a mark that never fully fades. If there's one lesson I've taken from all of this, it's the importance of listening to your instincts. That small voice in the back of your mind, the one that tells you something isn't right, it's there for a reason. I ignored it that night, dismissing my unease as irrational, and it almost cost me everything. I also learned that not every mystery is meant to be solved. Human curiosity is a powerful thing, but it can lead us to places we're not prepared to handle. That night, I stumbled into something far beyond my understanding, something that reminded me just how small and vulnerable we are in the grand scheme of things. For those of you watching this, I hope my story serves as a cautionary tale. Trust your instincts, be mindful of where you're going, and remember that the world is full of unknowns, some beautiful, some terrifying. And if you ever find yourself on a deserted road, with your GPS leading you into the middle of nowhere, think twice before continuing. Sometimes, the best decision you can make is to turn around and leave. It was a weekend trip, just like any other. Me and a couple of friends had decided to go on a hiking expedition in the dense woods near our town. The idea had been in the works for months, and there was nothing about it that seemed out of the ordinary. The plan was simple: a 2-day, 1-night hike through some of the most serene and peaceful nature trails around. We weren't experts by any means, but we had done enough hiking in the past to know how to handle ourselves in the woods. Our backpacks were packed with the essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, and of course, a tent and sleeping bags. We arrived early in the morning, with the sun still low, casting a warm golden light through the tree branches. The forest we chose wasn't known for anything special, but it was remote. The kind of place where you could get away from the hustle and bustle of life and just lose yourself in nature. We parked the car by the side of the road where the trail began, and from there, we set off, chatting and laughing, as most friends do on a trip like this. The first few hours were nothing short of perfect. The air was fresh, the chirping of birds filled the air, and the only sounds we heard were our boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. We passed by a small stream where we stopped for a water break, dipping our hands into the cool water before continuing on. Our group consisted of 3 people: myself, a close friend of mine, and someone who wasn't quite as close, but still a part of the crew. I knew the other 2 well enough to know we'd get along, but we each had different personalities. I was more of the cautious one, always double-checking things, making sure everything was in order. My friend, on the other hand, was more laid back, the type who could easily shrug off a minor inconvenience. The third member was somewhere in the middle, calm, but with a hint of curiosity that often made him want to explore areas of the trail that others would skip over. As we walked deeper into the woods, the scenery began to change. The trees grew denser, their thick trunks almost intertwining above us, creating a canopy that blocked out the sunlight, making everything feel more subdued. There was an eerie stillness that began to take over, though none of us really paid much attention to it. We kept chatting, swapping stories, and joking around as we continued our trek. At some point, we came across a fork in the trail. The sign that was supposed to direct us was old, weathered, and hard to read, but it didn't seem like a big deal. One path led in the direction we planned to go, and the other, well, it was a path that seemed to veer off to a different part of the forest, deeper into the unknown. We all agreed that it didn't matter much. After all, it was just another trail, right? We decided to take the road less traveled. The path seemed a little more rugged, but nothing we couldn't handle. As we walked further down it, the forest around us grew even denser, the trees taller and closer together. It felt almost as if the forest was closing in on us, but there was nothing overtly alarming about it. We continued down this trail, with no particular destination in mind other than to see where it led. The deeper we ventured, the less we heard the usual sounds of nature. The birds, the rustling leaves, the sounds of distant animals, they were all gone. It felt wrong. And yet, no one said anything. We had been out here before, after all, and everything seemed normal, despite the growing sense of isolation. It was around noon when we decided to stop for lunch. We found a clearing near a large rock and sat down to eat. The sunlight barely filtered through the canopy, casting a dim light over the area. It was quiet, too quiet. My friend and I sat down on the ground while the third member of our group explored nearby. He had always been the type to wander off, even if just for a few minutes. It was then that I noticed something odd. A strange, faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the leaves. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps. Not the natural footsteps you'd hear from animals or other hikers, but something more deliberate, almost like someone was walking just off the trail, staying hidden. I brushed it off, telling myself that it was nothing. But when I looked up, I realized that I couldn't see the guy who had wandered off. I scanned the clearing, the rocks, and the trees nearby. No sign of him. I called out his name, but there was no answer. "Hey, where'd you go?" I called again, more urgently this time. The air seemed to grow colder, the sun less warm. My friend stood up and started looking around too. "He must be wandered further up the trail," he said, trying to reassure me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Let's give it a few minutes, then we'll go find him," I said, my voice tinged with uncertainty. As we waited, the noise seemed to grow louder, closer. Something was off. My heart began to race, and the unsettling feeling that had started to creep in earlier was now undeniable. What was that noise? Where was he? Before I could think any further, I saw him. My friend appeared from the trees on the far side of the clearing, looking confused. "Where the hell did you go?" I asked. "I didn't go anywhere. I just walked a little ways down the trail to see if I could find a better spot," he replied. But that wasn't the problem. What was strange was that he didn't look like he had been walking down any trail at all. He was covered in dirt, his clothes slightly torn, and his expression pale, almost ghostly. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice growing more concerned. I don't know. I swear, I was just a few steps away from you guys, but it felt like I had been walking for hours. Everything around me changed. The trees looked different, the air felt heavy, and I started to hear footsteps, just like you did." He paused, eyes wide, as if he had just seen something he couldn't explain. "Something's wrong with this place," he whispered. "I think we need to leave." And that's when I knew something was off, really off. But none of us said it aloud. Instead, we packed up quickly, gathered our things, and prepared to retrace our steps, unaware that the forest would soon test our resolve in ways none of us were ready for. We had been walking for about an hour after lunch when the first sign of something strange made itself known. The woods, which had seemed serene and comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. The trees loomed taller, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms, blocking even more of the already dimming light. The trail had become less defined, but we pushed forward, assuming the path would eventually open up again. At first, it was just a small thing, something that could easily be explained away if you weren't paying attention. A movement in the corner of my eye. It wasn't an animal, too big, too strange. It seemed almost human-like, but just as I looked, it vanished behind a thick cluster of trees. I shrugged it off as nothing more than a trick of the light, but the unease that had been building in my chest only grew stronger. My friend walking ahead of me didn't seem to notice. His easygoing nature didn't allow for overthinking, so he kept moving forward, lost in his own thoughts. The other member of our group, the one who had gotten disoriented earlier, kept looking over his shoulder every few moments, like he was waiting for something to emerge from the woods. I could tell something was bothering him. After another few minutes of walking, I heard a crackling sound, faint but distinct. The kind of noise you'd expect to hear when someone is walking through dry leaves or stepping on branches. But the sound wasn't coming from ahead of us. It was coming from behind, somewhere deeper in the woods. I stopped in my tracks, turning around to see if anyone was coming. But there was nothing, just the thick, silent woods. I waited for a moment and then called out, "Is someone else here?" No answer. My friend ahead of me turned around and gave me a confused look. "What are you talking about?" I thought I heard something. "Like someone walking," I said, my voice sounding more uncertain than I intended. "It's just the wind," he replied, brushing me off with a casual wave of his hand. "It's probably just some branches shifting," but I wasn't so sure. The wind wasn't that strong, and the sound had been too deliberate. Too close. I felt a sudden chill run through me, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few seconds. "We should keep moving," I suggested, my voice now more urgent. We continued down the path, the atmosphere around us growing heavier with each step. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the sunlight had all but disappeared, casting everything into an unnatural twilight. The sound of birds, once so prevalent, had ceased completely, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The feeling of being watched crept in, something I hadn't felt since I was a child in the woods near my house. It was a sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried to focus on the path ahead. "All right, this is starting to feel off," my friend finally said, glancing around nervously. "Tell me about it," I replied, still on edge. "And not the only one feeling this, right?" The third member of our group, who had been unusually quiet since we left the clearing, spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel it too. It's like something's wrong with this place." He swallowed hard, as if trying to calm himself. We all stopped, looking at each other. The uneasy atmosphere was now undeniable. "Let's just keep moving," my friend said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. He didn't sound as confident as before. "We're almost through this part." We just need to get past this patch of trees, and the trail should open up again. We nodded in agreement, though none of us seemed fully convinced. Still, we pressed on, hoping to leave whatever it was behind. But that's when it happened. We had just crossed a small, crumbling bridge that spanned a shallow creek, the water bubbling quietly beneath us. We were almost to the edge of the woods, and the feeling of being watched was starting to fade, until I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from the direction we had just passed. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and it wasn't anyone from our group. It wasn't even in a language I could understand. It was more of a murmur, like someone was speaking under their breath, their words lost in the wind. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my heart racing. "Hear what?" my friend asked, stopping to look at me. "It sounded like someone talking," I said, trying to make sense of the strange sensation crawling up my spine. "No way," he said dismissively. "It's just the wind again. Let's keep going." But the third member of our group, the one who had gotten lost earlier, was looking back at the woods with a strange expression on his face. He wasn't even looking at us anymore. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated, as though he were in a trance. "It's coming from back there," he said, almost to himself. "Stop," I said, gripping his arm. "What are you talking about?" He shook his head, looking more and more disturbed. "I heard it too. I don't know what it was, but it sounded like someone calling us." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence in the woods now overwhelming. My friend's face had lost its usual confidence, his brow furrowed in confusion and worry. I looked at him and then back at the woods. Something wasn't right. The voice came again, this time clearer, though still indecipherable. It wasn't in any language I knew. It sounded distant, yet close at the same time. A low, unnatural murmur, like an echo of something long forgotten. The tension was thick in the air, each second dragging on like a weight pressing down on us. I could feel my pulse quicken as the voice grew louder. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming from just beyond the trees, from a place we couldn't see but could somehow feel. "All right, we need to go," I said firmly. "This isn't right. We're not safe here." I grabbed my bag, and the others followed suit, all of us now moving in a hurried, almost panicked manner. But before we could take another step, a loud crack broke the silence, and the voice stopped abruptly. It was as though the very air around us had been sucked away. We all froze. I could feel the ground beneath my feet tremble slightly, like a distant rumble in the earth. The voice was gone, replaced by the sound of something much worse, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and closing in. "Let's move. Now," I whispered urgently, my voice barely audible. We didn't look back as we began to walk faster, my heart pounding in my chest, every step feeling heavier than the last. The woods around us had changed. What had once been a peaceful trail was now an endless maze of shadows and strange sounds. And that's when I realized we weren't alone anymore. The woods, once seemingly just a backdrop for our hike, now felt alive with something sinister. The feeling of being watched had intensified, the air growing heavier with each step we took. Our pace quickened, but there was no sense of urgency in the way the woods responded. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind, but it was a creak that seemed to come from deep within them, a sound that resonated in my chest. The path had disappeared completely now, leaving us to navigate through thick underbrush, roots twisting and snarling beneath our feet. The sun, once a guiding force above, had disappeared behind a thick layer of clouds, leaving the forest in a dim, unnatural twilight. The kind of twilight that made it hard to distinguish between what was real and what was an illusion. "Shouldn't we be close to the exit by now?" one of us asked, his voice tinged with panic. I didn't know who had spoken, but the question echoed in my mind. We should have been out of the woods by now. We had been walking for hours, the sun was setting, and yet there was no sign of the trail we had started on. "We're lost," I said flatly, though the words left a sour taste in my mouth. I had known it deep down, but saying it out loud made it all the more real. "But we were following the trail," another voice protested. "We're not following it anymore," I said, the harsh reality sinking in. "We've been off the trail for at least an hour. We're not where we think we are." The realization hit like a punch to the gut. The woods, once familiar, now felt foreign. The trees towered over us, their dark branches blocking out the last light of day. The soft rustling of the leaves had turned into something more sinister, a constant whisper, too low to understand, but present nonetheless. Then the sounds began. At first, it was nothing more than a faint scraping noise, barely audible over the wind. But as we continued, it grew louder, like the sound of something, or someone, dragging itself through the brush. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, expecting to see something, anything, moving just beyond my line of sight. But there was nothing. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The others stopped, straining their ears. "I didn't hear anything," one of them said. "It's coming from over there," I said, pointing toward a darkened patch of trees, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. We all stood there, waiting. And then it came again, a dragging, scraping sound, closer this time, as though something was crawling through the underbrush toward us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the air grow colder around me. "Let's keep moving," one of them said, his voice shaky. But we didn't move. We couldn't. None of us wanted to be the first to turn our backs on whatever was out there. Another sound broke the silence, a thud like something heavy hitting the ground. It echoed through the woods, the sound of something large and solid colliding with the earth. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, and my stomach lurched. "Did you see that?" someone gasped. I spun around, my heart racing. In the fading light, I thought I saw something. A shadow, too large to be an animal, moving between the trees. It was just a flash, but it was enough to send a wave of cold fear through me. "Let's go. Now," I said, my voice more forceful this time. We started moving, but the woods had changed. The path that had once been so clear was now a maze of twisted branches and thick underbrush. Every step seemed to bring us deeper into the forest, further away from the safety we had once taken for granted. The air grew thicker with each passing minute, as though the forest itself were closing in on us. "Why is it so dark all of a sudden?" one of them asked, his voice panicked. I looked around. The sky had darkened unnaturally quickly, the last vestiges of sunlight swallowed by the thick canopy above us. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches intertwining, blocking out what little light remained. It was as though the forest had decided to keep us there, to trap us in its depths. Another noise, louder this time. The unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the trees, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice calling from the darkness. I froze. "Did you hear that?" The others nodded, their faces pale with fear. We were no longer alone. Something was out there, moving among us, stalking us through the trees. We had to find a way out. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more disoriented we became. The trees seemed to shift, their trunks twisting and turning as if they were alive, rearranging themselves to confuse us. The path, if it had ever truly existed, was now a distant memory. Every direction seemed to lead us further into the unknown. The wind picked up, howling through the branches, and the temperature dropped sharply. The air felt thick and suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. My breath came in short gasps, the fear growing in my chest with every step. And then we heard it again. A voice, clearer now, though still faint. It was distant, but it was unmistakable. "Help me!" The voice was weak, desperate, as if someone was calling out for assistance from somewhere deep in the woods. I could feel my stomach churn, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. "Do you think we should check it out?" one of them asked, his voice shaky. "No," I said firmly. "We need to get out of here now." But it was too late. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, and I stumbled, barely catching myself on a nearby tree. When I looked up, I realized we were no longer alone. The shadow was closer now, almost within arm's reach. It was no longer just a silhouette, it had formed, and it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, as if it were enjoying the fear it was causing. I felt my pulse race as I backed away, the others following suit. We had to get away from whatever this was, but every direction seemed to lead us deeper into the forest. "Go!" I shouted, pushing one of them forward. We ran, heartbeats thundering in our chests, as the forest seemed to close in around us. But no matter how fast we ran, we couldn't escape it. The shadows followed, just out of sight, but always there, always watching. The trees began to twist even more, their branches contorting into grotesque shapes, blocking our way. The once familiar trail had disappeared completely, and we were now lost in a nightmare of our own making. Something was toying with us. Something was leading us further into the woods, and there was no way out. We ran, our legs burning with the effort, our breaths ragged in the cold, stale air. But it didn't matter. The forest seemed to have no end, and no matter how fast we moved, it was always just one step ahead of us. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, an uncontrollable surge of fear that made it harder to think, harder to breathe. The shadows were closer now, moving faster, and we were being hunted. At first, I had tried to stay calm, to rationalize what was happening. But now, there was no denying it. We were lost, completely, utterly lost, and something was hunting us. Something was in the woods with us, and it wasn't human. It wasn't even an animal. It was something far worse. The woods had become an alien world, an oppressive maze of twisted trees and thick underbrush. The wind howled through the branches, but the sound was wrong. It didn't sound like the natural gusts of wind anymore. It sounded like something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable, carried on the breeze. It wasn't a whisper, it was a cry, a tortured, drawn-out wail that sent a chill straight to my bones. We had stopped running by now. The exhaustion had set in, and the fear had completely overtaken us. We were huddled together, standing in a small clearing that felt more like a trap than a safe haven. Every direction felt like it was closing in on us. We couldn't run anymore, we had nowhere to go. The darkness had swallowed the last of the light, and now the forest was a place of pure blackness, an unyielding void that seemed to stretch out endlessly before us. But there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw something moving. A figure. It wasn't human, not fully. The way it moved was unnatural, like it was gliding over the ground, its limbs too long, too twisted. It was barely visible at first, just a silhouette against the trees. But as it stepped forward, the full horror of what was before us became clear. It was tall, too tall, and its body was emaciated, its skin stretched tightly over the bones, as if it hadn't eaten in years. Its face was the most horrifying part. It was a grotesque mockery of a human face, its features warped and distorted. Its eyes were huge, sunken into the skull, glowing faintly with a sickly greenish way. The mouth, it was too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face, filled with sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to gleam in the dim light. The creature stood there, watching us, as if it were savoring our fear. Its gaze was fixed on us, and I could feel it deep in my chest, like it was reaching into my very soul. And then, it moved. In an instant, it was no longer standing at the edge of the clearing. It was right in front of us, impossibly fast. The sound of its movement was deafening, a harsh, scraping noise that seemed to vibrate in the air, shaking the ground beneath our feet. My legs finally gave way, and I collapsed to my knees, my vision spinning as I tried to process what was happening. One of the others screamed, a sound that echoed through the woods, sharp and panicked. The creature's eyes flicked toward him, and that was all it took. It was upon him in an instant, its long, twisted fingers reaching out to grab him. The scream died in his throat as the creature's hand closed around his head, and in that moment, I could see the terror in his eyes, the realization that he was utterly helpless. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. My brain was frozen in place, caught in the grip of raw, unfiltered terror. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I wanted to fight, but I couldn't even find the strength to lift my arms. The others, two of them, were still frozen beside me, their faces pale with fear. They were watching the creature, watching as it lifted our friend off the ground, his body dangling like a ragdoll in its grip. He tried to scream, tried to fight back, but it was no use. The creature's grip was too strong. It turned its head slowly, its twisted mouth curling into what could almost be called a smile. I could feel it, its presence, its malevolent energy was suffocating. It wasn't just a creature of the woods, it was something ancient, something that had been here long before we ever set foot in its domain. The woods weren't just a backdrop, they were its home, its territory, and we were nothing more than intruders. And then, with a sound that made my stomach churn, the creature crushed our friend's head. There was no blood, no gore, just a sickening crunch as if his skull were nothing more than brittle wood. I had to get out. I had to escape. In that instant, everything around me seemed to warp. The trees groaned, their trunks twisting as if they were alive, bending toward us like the arms of some monstrous being. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my leg as I stumbled backward. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the creature, no, the thing, standing over me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in them, something beyond malice. Something ancient and unknowable. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my body frozen, my heart racing in terror. And then, the creature reached down toward me, its long fingers curling into claws as it loomed over me. This was it. This was the end. And yet, as the claws descended toward me, a sudden, violent force ripped through the air, sending the creature flying backward. I didn't know what had happened, whether it was my own fear-fueled mind finally breaking free or something else entirely. But the creature was gone, and I was left in the clearing, panting, covered in sweat, and alone. The others, what had happened to them? Where were they? But it didn't matter anymore. The forest was silent again, the weight of its presence pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I was alone in the woods, and I didn't know how to get out. I stood there, my body trembling, my mind a whirlwind of chaos. The creature was gone, but the terror it left behind was still very much alive. The silence of the woods pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. It was as if the forest itself was waiting, watching, just beyond the reach of my senses. I didn't know what had happened in that clearing. What had sent the creature flying back? Who or what had intervened? The air around me felt still, almost too still, as though the entire world had stopped moving. The trees, once alive with the wind's whisper, were now eerily silent, their branches hanging limply in the dead air. I could feel the presence of the others. Their absence was like a weight on my chest. I wanted to call out for them, but I knew it was useless. There was no point. The creature had taken them. I had heard their screams, seen their fear, and I knew I was the last one left. I took a shaky step forward, my legs almost giving way beneath me. The forest seemed to shift around me, the shadows growing deeper, more oppressive. I turned back to the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the creature, no trace of the others. Just the stillness, the emptiness that seemed to stretch out endlessly before me. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, trying to make sense of the madness that had overtaken the night. I glanced up, trying to spot the moon through the canopy of trees, but the sky was blocked by the dense foliage. It was dark, too dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the immediate area. The woods had swallowed the light, leaving me with nothing but the cold, suffocating darkness. I had to move. I had to get out. I turned away from the clearing, my feet dragging through the underbrush as I stumbled forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground beneath me was pulling me down. The air was thick with moisture, the scent of earth and decay clinging to my skin. The woods seemed alive, but not in a natural way. There was something else here, something wrong. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, but even that felt unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath. My mind was a blur, and my only instinct was to keep moving, to escape. But where was I going? The woods stretched on endlessly in every direction. I had no sense of which way I was heading, no clue which path would lead me out of this nightmare. The memories of what had happened to the others haunted me. The creature, its terrible face, the horrible noise as it had crushed our friend's skull. I could still hear the scream in my head, feel the terror that had gripped me as I watched it happen. It had been too fast, too powerful. We had been no match for it, and now I was the only one left. I had no answers, no closure, just a gnawing emptiness that was worse than any physical pain. My heart ached with the loss of my friends, the feeling of helplessness gnawing at my insides. But the forest didn't care about my grief. The forest only cared about one thing: survival. As I stumbled through the woods, I caught sight of something up ahead, something different. It was a clearing, but not one I recognized. It wasn't the same place where we had been trapped earlier. This was a new area, a place I had never seen before. The ground was covered in thick moss. The trees stood taller, their trunks wider. There was no sign of the path we had been following, just dense underbrush and towering trees. I walked cautiously toward the clearing, my senses heightened. It felt wrong. The air in the clearing was colder, the shadows deeper. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. A strange feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I was being watched. I stepped into the clearing, and as soon as my foot hit the ground, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the very earth beneath me had come alive, wrapping itself around me, tightening its grip. And then I saw it. There, in the center of the clearing, stood an old stone altar. It was covered in moss and vines, the stone weathered with age. I could feel its presence, its power radiating from it. It wasn't just an altar, it was a marker, a warning. I took a step back, my pulse quickening as I realized what I had found. This place, this altar, it wasn't part of the forest. It wasn't part of the world I knew. It was something older, something ancient, something that had been waiting for someone like me to stumble upon it. I knew, deep in my bones, that this was the heart of the woods. This was where the creature had come from. This was where the darkness lived. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, to escape, to forget all of this. But the forest wouldn't let me. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, the pressure building until I thought my chest would explode. I had to go. There was no other choice. But the moment I turned to leave, something stopped me. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable, called my name. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was clear enough to make my blood run cold. Help! It wasn't my name. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a cry for help, a desperate plea, as if the very woods themselves were begging for mercy. I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I ran, pushing through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and fallen branches. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let the forest claim me too. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had no meaning in that place. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't know if the creature was still following me, or if something else was. I didn't know if I was even headed in the right direction. But then, through the trees, I saw it. The faint outline of the road. The real world. I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, My breath ragged, but I made it. I broke through the trees and onto the road, gasping for air. The night was quiet here, the stillness almost peaceful in contrast to the madness of the forest. I had escaped, but I didn't feel free. Not really. I turned back toward the woods, the darkness looming behind me. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I didn't know if anyone would ever come back here. But one thing was certain. The forest wasn't done with me yet. It never would be. The woods had its claim on me now, and sooner or later I knew I'd have to face it again. But for now, I was free. At least for a little while. The city lights were a distant blur as I drove away from the woods. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The familiar hum of the engine should have been comforting, but it only reminded me of how far I had come from the madness it left behind. Yet, no matter how far I drove, the forest darkness clung to my mind, a weight that wouldn't lift. I hadn't told anyone what had happened, not yet. I couldn't. How could I explain something so impossible? How could I make anyone believe that I had seen the unspeakable, something that defied logic and reason? The more I thought about it, the more the memories twisted in my mind. The creature, the altar, the voices, it all felt like a dream. A nightmare I hadn't fully woken from. I knew I needed to tell someone, but fear held me back. Fear that they would dismiss it, that they would say I was just traumatized by what had gone through. But what if I wasn't? What if it was real? The only thing I was sure of was that I couldn't go back to the woods. I couldn't even bear the thought of returning to that place. The road stretched on, but my thoughts never left the trees. It wasn't just the creature that haunted me. It was the feeling of being powerless, of being swallowed by something ancient and unknowable. It was the fear that no matter how fast I ran, I would always be a part of that place. As the miles passed and the familiar sights of the city slowly crept into view, I tried to focus on the present, on the normalcy of life. But the past few days had shattered any sense of peace I had once known. The images of my friends, their faces twisted in terror, were burned into my mind. I could still hear their screams echoing in the back of my head. The sound of bones breaking, the thud of something enormous crashing through the trees. I couldn't erase it. I didn't think I ever would. I pulled into my driveway, the house bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. It felt wrong, almost foreign, like I was an intruder in my own life. The familiar surroundings, the comfort of home, felt hollow, like they no longer belonged to me. I had left something behind in those woods, something important, something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't done with me. The house was still. Too still. I stepped inside, the silence pressing against me, suffocating me. I expected peace, but all I found was a deep, unsettling calm that only amplified the chaos inside my mind. My own reflection in the hallway mirror startled me. I hardly recognized myself, pale, wide-eyed, like a ghost who had returned from a place it couldn't escape. The man who had left for that trip was not the same man who had come back. Something inside me had shifted, and I wasn't sure it could ever return to its original form. I made my way to the bedroom, the silence echoing with each step. I sat on the bed, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of it all. But the truth was, there was no sense to be made. I had seen something beyond comprehension, and no amount of reasoning could make it disappear. That night, I tried to sleep, but the darkness clung to me, both inside and out. My eyes were wide open, searching the room for something, anything, that might reassure me. But nothing did. Every creak of the house seemed like a warning. Every shadow seemed like it might be something more sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something had followed me back from the forest. And that was the hardest part, the uncertainty of it all. I couldn't explain what had happened, and that lack of understanding gnawed at me. The days that followed were filled with a quiet terror. I couldn't bring myself to talk about it to anyone, not even my closest friends. Who would believe me? How could I even put it into words? Every time I thought about the forest, I felt a sense of dread deep in my chest. And it wasn't just the memory of what had happened. It was the knowledge that I hadn't escaped. Not really. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the presence of the woods. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the faint echo of footsteps, as though the forest itself was waiting for me to return. I wondered if the creature was still out there, still hunting, still lurking in the shadows. But it wasn't just the creature that haunted me. It was the altar, the feeling of something ancient, something alive, that I couldn't understand. Something that had waited for me, something that I couldn't escape, no matter how far I ran. Months passed, but the terror never left me. I tried to move on, to forget, but it lingered, a constant presence in my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods had claimed me, and that one day it would call me back. The dreams started. At first, they were just fleeting images, shadows dancing at the edge of my vision. But then they became more vivid. I could hear the whispers, see the creatures moving in the dark. I could feel the weight of the altar pressing down on me. Every time I woke up, my heart raced, my body drenched in sweat. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, just a product of my fear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I don't know why it still calls to me, why the forest still haunts me. Maybe it's the power of the woods, something I will never fully understand. Maybe it's because I know, deep down, that I can never truly leave it behind. The woods had claimed me, and it would never let me go. It all started a few years ago, in a small, nearly forgotten town nestled at the edge of nowhere. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the air seems to carry stories of the past. I had just landed a new job at an old hospital on the outskirts of the town. The building itself was a relic from decades ago, its towering brick exterior covered in ivy and chipped paint. The hospital had once been a busy center for medical care, but over the years, the numbers dwindled and people started finding their care elsewhere. It wasn't long before the hospital was mostly deserted, its halls echoing with the sound of creaky floorboards and the distant hum of outdated equipment. I remember the first time I walked in. The air felt thick, almost stale, as if it hadn't seen fresh life in years. The main lobby still had a certain grandeur, with high ceilings and old, polished wood furnishings that whispered of a time long gone. Despite the peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to the place, there was something oddly comforting about it. The staff was small, just a handful of nurses and orderlies, a few doctors who were more often absent than present. Most of them were there out of obligation, not passion, stuck in a place that had little hope of revival. But for me, this hospital felt like a fresh start. I didn't know much about the place when I first signed the papers. I had been looking for a job, and this one seemed to fit the bill. Quiet, steady, and with minimal hassle. As a man in my mid-30s, I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, just the usual daily grind. I was accustomed to the rhythms of the medical world, appointments, paperwork, and the occasional rush when something went wrong. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. One of the things that struck me right away was the hospital's age. It seemed like every hallway, every room, had a story to tell. You could feel the history in the walls, in the floors that creaked underfoot, in the faint traces of old paint and wallpaper peeling away like pages in an ancient book. Yet, there was an eerie quietness to it all. There were places in the hospital that felt like they hadn't seen anyone in years, and others where the atmosphere felt strangely suffocating. I was assigned to work the night shift, which at first didn't seem too unusual. It was a quiet time in the hospital, and the night crew was often responsible for handling any emergencies and ensuring that patients were well taken care of. The nights were long, but there was something peaceful about the routine, checking on patients, making rounds, and ensuring everything was in order. But as the nights went on, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a flicker of the lights here, a cold draft that would appear for no reason, a strange noise coming from one of the rooms that no one could quite explain. At first, I brushed it off. Hospitals are old buildings, and old buildings make strange noises. It wasn't anything to get worked up about. But as the days went by, those odd occurrences became more frequent, more intense. And that's when I began to wonder if there was something more to this place than met the eye. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Other staff members, longtime employees who had worked there for years, started sharing their own experiences, odd sounds, unexplained cold spots, strange feelings of being watched. It wasn't just one or two people. It was nearly everyone. And yet, nobody ever talked about it openly. It was as though they had all learned to live with it, to ignore the strange happenings, to push them to the back of their minds. But for me, it wasn't so easy to ignore. It gnawed at the back of my mind, and I began to feel the weight of it as I walked the empty corridors, alone during the long, quiet nights. There was something unsettling about the way the hospital seemed to sigh and groan as if it were alive, an old, tired creature just waiting for its time to pass. The cold drafts, the strange noises, they were becoming harder to dismiss. And that's when I decided to find out what was really going on. Little did I know that this decision would lead me into a terrifying journey I wasn't prepared for. I began my investigation quietly. I didn't want to alarm anyone just yet. Most of the nurses and staff were already weary, and I didn't want to add to the growing sense of unease. But I had to know what was happening. Was it just my imagination, or was something truly wrong with this place? The more I worked, the more the sense of something watching me grew. Something was definitely off about the place. Something that no one seemed willing to acknowledge, and that, for some reason, only I seemed to notice. The hospital was beginning to reveal its secrets to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were only the beginning of something much darker that lay hidden in the shadows of those crumbling walls. It was just after midnight when the first truly unsettling thing happened. I was in the basement of the hospital, checking the equipment. It made it part of my routine to inspect the storage area in the lower levels. It was a place I often found myself alone, and while it wasn't a job I particularly enjoyed, it had become something of a comfort, familiar, predictable, and easy. The basement was dimly lit, and the narrow hallways, lined with shelves of old medical supplies and outdated machinery, seemed to stretch endlessly. There was always an eerie quiet down there, and that night was no different. I was walking past the rows of equipment when I heard something, a faint sound, almost like a hum, coming from the far end of the hallway. At first, I thought it might be the refrigeration units kicking on, or perhaps the pipes settling, which I had gotten used to hearing over the months. But this sound was different. It was softer, more distinct, almost like a voice. I stood still for a moment, trying to determine where it was coming from. The noise continued, a subtle hum, followed by what sounded like a muffled conversation. My first instinct was to brush it off. I figured it was just one of the other staff members. Maybe a nurse had come down to retrieve some supplies, or a doctor had left something behind. But as I walked toward the source of the sound, I began to realize that there was no one in sight. The hallway was empty, save for the dust motes floating in the weak light from the overhead bulbs. I paused, unsure of what to do. The sound was still there, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't exactly a conversation, not in the way people speak to each other. It was more like a series of unintelligible murmurs, rising and falling in volume, but never making any clear sense. I turned the corner, thinking that I'd find someone there, but instead, the space was completely empty. The only thing I could hear was the faint hum of the old ventilation system, which had always had a peculiar way of making the place feel colder than it should. Confused, I turned back toward the hallway and tried to make sense of what I'd just experienced. Had I imagined it? Could it have been the building settling again? But no, this wasn't the usual creaking I'd grown accustomed to. This was different. It wasn't just a random noise. It felt deliberate, as though something was trying to reach out from the shadows. I decided to investigate further. I checked the nearby rooms, flicking on the lights and peering into each one, but they were all empty. The strange hums seemed to have stopped, replaced by the familiar quiet of the building. But as I turned to leave the basement, something else caught my attention. A door at the far end of the hallway, one that I had passed countless times before. It was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it earlier, and I was certain that it had been closed when it walked down the hallway just moments ago. But now it stood open, revealing a pitch-black room beyond. It was strange because this particular room had been locked for as long as I could remember. The hospital had been undergoing some renovations, and this area was scheduled for demolition, so there was no reason for it to be unlocked. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I should have walked away. I knew I should have just left the basement and gone about my usual rounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling me toward that door, that room, that darkness. So I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door creaked as I pushed it open wider, and a cold gust of air rushed past me, making me shiver involuntarily. It was as if the room itself exhaled. Inside, the darkness was overwhelming. I couldn't see a thing. I reached for the light switch, but stopped myself just before I flipped it. A strange feeling washed over me, a sense that something was watching me from within the shadows. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been, as though the room had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to disturb it. I stood there for a few moments, the darkness pressing in around me. I don't know why I stayed. Something was pulling me in, urging me to step further into the room, but another part of me wanted to run. I could feel my heartbeat quickening, the adrenaline rising in my chest. My mind was racing. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was I imagining things? Was this just the product of too many late nights in an old, quiet building? But then I heard it again. The hum. It wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was coming from inside the room, just beyond the edge of my vision. The sound seemed to surround me, as though it was coming from all directions, from deep within the walls themselves. I took a step back, but as I did, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The hallway was empty. I reached for the door, desperate to escape, but when I pulled on the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged within me. I tried again, but it was stuck, locked. I was trapped in this room, in the dark, with no idea what was happening. The humming sound was growing louder now, echoing through the room like a distant chant. I could feel the walls closing in on me. The air felt thick, oppressive, suffocating. That's when I noticed the faint outline of something in the corner of the room. It wasn't clear at first, just a shadow, something indistinct. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it more clearly, a figure standing there, motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. The figure was tall, thin, and dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown, the kind I'd seen in photos from the early days of the facility. But there was something wrong about it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. Or maybe it wasn't staring. Maybe it was just there. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my back. My body was frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. I couldn't take my eyes off it. And then, without warning, the figure seemed to melt into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The door opened with a sudden creak, and I stumbled out into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I made my way up the stairs, my mind racing. Had I seen what I thought I saw? Was it just a trick of the light, or was something truly wrong with this place? That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The image of the figure lingered in my mind, haunting me as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of working late hours in an old, creaky hospital was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something dark had been awakened in that room, and I had no idea how far it would go. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Work at the hospital continued, but it felt different. It wasn't just the constant hum of the old machinery or the flickering lights that I'd come to expect. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite place, but it was always there, like a cold draft that never quite left. a weight hanging in the air. Every night, as I worked my rounds, I found myself more on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder, listening for that hum, that whisper of movement just beyond my reach. At first, I tried to push the memory of the dark figure from my mind. I told myself that it had just been tired, that my mind had played tricks on me in the shadows. But then, strange things started happening. The kind of things that couldn't be explained away so easily. I was alone one evening, just after the last of the staff had left. The hospital was quiet, too quiet. It was a typical late night. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. I was in the emergency room, checking some of the equipment. My footsteps echoed softly through the empty halls as I moved between the rooms. But as I approached the supply closet, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a sound, a soft tapping, almost like someone knocking gently on the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was alone. There was no one else here. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, everything was still, and then, as if it were mocking my growing unease, the sound started again. Only this time, it was coming from inside the supply closet. I stepped back, my breath quickening. I knew I should leave, but my feet were glued to the floor. I had to see what it was. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, every nerve in my body on high alert. My hand shook as I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I flicked the light switch, and the dim bulb overhead flickered to life. Nothing. The room was empty, just shelves stacked with medical supplies. No one. No source for the tapping. But as I scanned the room, something caught my eye. A box had been moved. A large cardboard box that I was certain had been placed in the far corner the last time I had checked. It was now positioned closer to the door, as though someone had been rummaging through it. My pulse quickened. No one had been here. I was sure of it. Yet the box was in a completely different spot, and I could almost swear I could still feel the faintest trace of someone's presence in the room. I closed the door, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in my bones. I quickly made my way to the stairwell, desperate to get out of the lower levels. The air was thick and stale, and the silence was suffocating. The farther I walked, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though it was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I reached the staircase that led up to the main floor, but as I turned to ascend, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A figure! It was standing at the far end of the hallway, just outside the janitor's closet. A tall, thin silhouette. The figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for me to notice it. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart raced. The figure was wearing what looked like an old hospital gown, similar to the one I had seen in the basement. But this time, the figure wasn't just a shadow. It was more solid, more real. I blinked, and in that instant, the figure was gone. I didn't stick around to figure out where it had gone. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling with each step. I made it to the upper level and quickly locked myself in the office, hoping that I could shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was seeing things. But the unease continued to gnaw at me, growing stronger with each passing hour. And then it happened again. The next night, I found myself back on the lower levels, checking on the security cameras and ensuring everything was running smoothly. The hospital was empty, save for a few staff members in the building, but the entire place felt off. I couldn't explain it, but I was beginning to feel like I wasn't alone. I was passing through the hallway near the radiology department when I heard a noise, a scraping sound, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the storage room at the end of the hall. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached for the door handle, I heard it again, scraping like nails against metal. My stomach churned. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Inside, the lights were flickering, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The source of the sound was clear now, A small metal cart was scraping across the floor, slowly, deliberately, as if being pushed by some unseen force. But there was no one there. The cart was moving on its own, inching forward, its wheels dragging across the tile with an eerie squeal. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. I should have left. I knew that. But something made me stay. Something made me watch as the cart moved slowly toward me. I could hear the sound of it scraping against the floor growing louder, the metal on tile creating an unsettling screech that echoed down the hall. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the cart stopped. The lights flickered one last time before they went out entirely, plunging the room into complete darkness. I froze, standing in the pitch-black room, listening to the sounds of my own breathing. I felt my way along the wall to find the light switch, my heart pounding in my ears. But when I turned the switch, nothing happened. The room remained dark. I didn't know how long I stood there in the darkness, but when the lights finally flickered back on, the cart had disappeared. I checked the entire room, but it was gone. The storage room was empty. There was no sign of the cart or anything unusual. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with anymore. Was it the building itself? Was it something or someone else? The events were becoming more frequent, more intense. Every night, I found myself chasing shadows, hearing whispers in the dark, seeing figures that vanished when I blinked. Each encounter left me more unsettled than the last. I began to question my sanity. I told myself that the fatigue from late nights and the isolation of working in such a large, empty hospital was getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something in that hospital, something ancient and malicious. And it was growing stronger, feeding on the fear that I couldn't help but feel. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the strange events seemed to escalate. I was beginning to wonder if there was something hidden in that hospital, something that had been waiting all this time to reveal itself. But what was it? And why was it focusing on me? The questions swirled in my mind, but I didn't have any answers. Only more fear, more uncertainty, more things that didn't make sense. I couldn't stop now. I had to find out what was going on. I had to know the truth, even if it meant going further into the darkness. Even if it meant uncovering something that I might not be able to escape. The next few days felt like a blur of escalating tension, each moment heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital itself was changing, warping around me, becoming something foreign, something hostile. The eerie occurrences continued to grow more frequent, things moving without explanation, the temperature dropping in certain areas, shadows that felt alive, following me when I turned around. By now, I had done everything I could to stay grounded. I tried to reason with myself. The stress, the isolation, the pressure of working in such a large, empty space, especially after hours, it was all playing tricks on my mind. I was just exhausted. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself of that, there was always something deep inside me, something primal, that told me I was wrong. That there was something in that hospital, and it wasn't going away. The real turning point came one night when I was working alone again. It was well past midnight when the hospital went eerily quiet, even for a place that was normally so empty at night. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the shuffle of my shoes on the tile floor, the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, all the normal sounds seemed to have faded, leaving only silence. A silence so thick it was suffocating. I was on the third floor, moving between the rooms to check on the equipment and make sure everything was running smoothly. I wasn't really paying attention to anything in particular, just going through the motions, trying to get through the night. But something was different that night. Something in the air felt off, like the entire hospital was holding its breath. And then I heard it. A door creaking open, slowly, painfully. I froze in my tracks, my heart jumping in my chest. It wasn't a normal sound. It was like something was deliberately trying to be heard, like it was inviting me to investigate. It came from down the hall, somewhere near the patient rooms. I could feel my palms starting to sweat, my throat dry. This wasn't the first time it heard something like this, but it felt heavier, more deliberate. With a deep breath, I forced myself to move forward, my footsteps barely making a sound as I crept down the corridor. The lights above flickered again, casting long, strange shadows along the walls, making the hall look even more like a place out of a nightmare. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed that the door to room 307, which had always been locked, was now slightly ajar. I couldn't remember ever seeing it open before. My heart pounded in my chest. I should have turned back. I knew it, but I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. With a shaking hand, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the blinds drawn, the only light coming from the dim hallway outside. But there was something about the room. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the cold. It hit me the moment I stepped inside, the air colder than anywhere else in the building, biting into my skin like ice. I walked in further, my eyes adjusting to the low light, my breath visible in the freezing air. Everything looked normal at first glance, the hospital bed, the machines, the sterile smell of antiseptic. But as I moved deeper into the room, something caught my eye. The bed wasn't empty. A figure lay in the bed, shrouded in darkness, the blanket pulled up to its chest. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the shape of a person, lying motionless. My heart started to race. I knew I wasn't supposed to be here, but my feet moved of their own accord. I took a step closer, each footfall echoing in the silence. That's when I saw it. The figure was not breathing. There was no rise and fall of the chest, no soft exhale, just stillness. And yet, I couldn't look away. I reached out a hand, hesitant, unsure of what I was doing. But before I could touch the figure, the lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see the shadows in the room shifting, bending unnaturally. And then, just like that, the figure in the bed sat up. I staggered back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The movement was sudden, jerky, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. It was as if the figure had been waiting for me, watching me, and now it was aware of my presence. I could finally make out the details. The figure in the bed was wearing a hospital gown, but the skin was pale, almost translucent. The face was gaunt, hollow, the eyes wide open and empty, black voids where the pupils should have been. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, a smile that didn't belong to a human being. It wasn't just a smile, it was a mocking grin, a grin that seemed to know my fear. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I was trapped, frozen in place by the sheer horror of what I was seeing. The figure slowly raised a hand toward me, the fingers long and unnaturally thin. It opened its mouth, and for the first time, I heard it speak. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, hollow, like a breath of ice. I could feel the words sink into my chest, an icy grip that threatened to crush my heart. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls bending inwards. The temperature plummeted even further, and the shadows on the walls grew longer, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could barely breathe. It felt like something was choking me, like the very room was alive, closing in around me. "You're going to help me," it said again, its voice more insistent this time. I couldn't understand what it meant. What was it asking? Why me? I wanted to speak, to ask it, but the words wouldn't come. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, a weight that pressed down on my chest and left me gasping for air. And then, just as the figure reached out for me, I heard something else. It was coming from the hallway. I snapped out of my stupor, a single thought piercing the fog of terror that had consumed me. Someone was calling my name. I couldn't tell who it was. Everything around me felt so distant, so far away. But I had to get out of that room. I didn't wait another second. My legs finally moved, and I sprinted out of the room, the sound of the figure's laughter echoing in my mind as I ran down the hall. The temperature slowly returned to normal as I reached the staircase, but the sense of dread, the feeling that something was following me, never left. By the time I reached the main floor, I was gasping for air, my mind reeling. I couldn't process what I had just seen. What had just happened? Was it real? Or had I lost my mind? All I knew was that something in that hospital was watching me, waiting for me, and it wasn't finished yet. The events of that night left me shattered, my mind tangled in a maze of confusion and terror. I had run from room 307, but the fear I felt didn't dissipate when I reached the main floor. It lingered, hanging in the air like a suffocating fog, pressing down on my chest with each breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that maybe it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in that hospital, something that had been waiting for me, and it wasn't just going to disappear. For the next few days, I did my best to avoid the building after hours. I came in for my shifts during the day, but once the sun dipped below the horizon, I was out the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stayed, I would be consumed by whatever haunted those walls. The dread that had followed me around the hospital had seeped into my life outside as well. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure from room 307, its twisted grin and empty eyes, waiting in the darkness. But no matter how hard I tried to stay away, I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was happening in that hospital, or it would never stop. It was only a matter of time before it dragged me back into the depths of its nightmare. So, after days of internal struggle, I returned. It was a cold, rainy evening when I arrived, the streets slick with the remnants of a storm that had passed through earlier. The hospital loomed before me, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, but I was determined. I had to face it. I walked through the front doors, the usual sterile smell of the hospital hitting me as I entered. The hallways were quiet, too quiet, and I could feel the silence stretching out before me like a threat. My footsteps echoed off the walls, louder than they should have been in the stillness of the building. The place was empty, or so it seemed. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't go into room 307 again. I couldn't face that thing again. But I had to know what was going on. I had to understand why the hospital felt alive, why it seemed to be hiding something beneath its sterile exterior. I had to find out who or what was responsible for the terror I had experienced. I started by searching the hospital records. I spent hours in the dusty, forgotten archives, digging through old files and documents. The hospital had been around for decades, and I knew I'd never be able to sift through all of it, but I had to try. The deeper I went, the more I began to uncover things that didn't sit right with me. Patient records, old medical charts, and personal accounts of strange occurrences over the years. There were mentions of strange disappearances, nurses, doctors, even patients who had gone missing without a trace. Some had been found dead, others had simply vanished. Each time, the hospital's administrators had covered it up. There were no official investigations, no inquiries. Everything had been swept under the rug. But there was more. There was a pattern. The strange events that I had experienced weren't isolated incidents. They had been happening for years. And every time someone came close to figuring out what was really going on, they either disappeared or were forced out of the hospital. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the records, each page revealing more and more about the dark history of the building. And then, finally, I found it, the original blueprints for the hospital. There, in the margins of the old map, were notes scrawled in faded ink. The heart of the hospital lies beneath. The dead walk here. No one leaves. I could feel my pulse quicken. What did it mean? What was beneath the hospital? And why had no one told me about it? I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to find out what lay beneath. That's when I found the hidden stairwell. It wasn't marked on any of the hospital's official maps, and it didn't appear in any of the records. But there it was, tucked away behind a set of rusted, locked doors in the basement. I had to force the door open, my hands trembling as I searched for the key, desperate to uncover the truth. The stairwell was narrow, the air damp and musty, the walls slick with years of neglect. I descended slowly, my flashlight flickering with each step. The deeper I went, the colder it became. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the further I went, the more I could feel the weight of something watching me from the shadows. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a large metal door. It was old, rusted, and sealed shut with a heavy lock. I stared at it for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something told me I shouldn't open it, but I had come this far. I had to. With a grunt, I managed to force the door open. Behind it was a vast, empty space, an underground chamber, long forgotten by the rest of the hospital. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, there was a large, cracked stone altar. It was covered in old, dried blood. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the stone with care. The entire room felt wrong, like it had been built with a purpose that I couldn't comprehend. But as I stepped closer to the altar, I realized what it was. The altar wasn't just a ceremonial object. It was a prison. As I stepped closer, I could feel something stirring in the air. Something ancient, powerful. And then I saw the figure. It was the same one I had seen in room 307. The same twisted, hollow figure with empty eyes and that sickening smile. It was kneeling at the altar, its head bent low, as if in worship. But it wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, scattered around the room, all of them kneeling, all of them waiting. The hospital wasn't haunted, I realized. It was a place of sacrifice. A place where the dead had been bound to serve a force far older and darker than I could ever comprehend. The figure looked up at me, its eyes locking onto mine. The smile on its face grew wider, impossibly wide. And then it spoke. "You're too late." I didn't stay to hear more. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had before, back up the stairs, through the hallways, out into the night. I didn't stop until I was far away from the hospital, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I fled, I knew that the hospital's grip would never truly loosen. The figures I had seen in that chamber, the ones bound to the altar, would always be waiting, and the horrors I had uncovered would haunt me for the rest of my life. The truth was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined, and there would be no escaping it. The days that followed felt like a blur. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the figures in that underground chamber. The hollow eyes, the twisted smiles, the ritualistic kneeling, it haunted me. Every noise in my apartment, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against my window felt like a threat. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, something that had left the hospital behind to trail me through my waking life. The figures, the altar, the stone walls, they were etched into my mind, impossible to forget. I tried to move on, to return to normal, to resume the life I had before I ever stepped foot into that cursed building. But the truth was, nothing would ever be the same again. I could no longer look at hospitals the same way. I couldn't even walk through a hallway without imagining the shadows lurking in the corners, the hidden rooms where the dead whispered their secrets. What I learned that night in the hospital was something I could never unlearn. That place, that hospital, wasn't just a building. It was a nexus, a place where something ancient, something far darker than I could ever have imagined, had taken root. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was always there, waiting to pull me back in. I went back to the hospital once, a few weeks after everything happened. I told myself I needed to find closure, that I had to see the place one last time to make sure it was all real. But when I arrived, the building was empty. It was like a ghost town, the doors locked, the windows boarded up. The rooms where I had spent so many hours, where the terror had first started, were silent. I walked through the abandoned hallways, the only sound my footsteps echoing against the cold, empty walls. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, through a cracked door, I caught a glimpse of the room where it all began. Room 307. But it was different now. The door was ajar, and I could see something in the corner of the room, a dark shape that shifted as I watched. I froze. For a moment, everything around me seemed to stop. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something terrible. The shape moved again, and I could feel the cold rush of fear sweeping over me. I knew what I had to do. I knew I had to leave. But something kept me rooted to the spot. The door creaked open wider, and as I looked into the room, I saw something that I will never forget. There, standing in the center of the room, was the altar. But this time, it wasn't empty. The figures, the same ones I had seen before, were there, kneeling once again. And in the center of them, there was a new shape, a new figure that I couldn't quite make out. But it didn't matter. I knew what it was. It was calling to me. With a burst of panic, I turned and fled from the hospital, never looking back. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I knew I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew I never would. But one thing was certain. I was not meant to know. The hospital had its secrets, and I was never supposed to uncover them. I moved away soon after that. I didn't want to stay anywhere near the memories, the terror that still clung to me like a second skin. I tried to start fresh, to live a life untouched by the horrors of the past. But I knew, deep down, that it would never truly be over. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake in the middle of the night, I wonder if I will ever truly be free of the hospital's curse. Will I ever escape the shadows that seem to follow me, even in the quiet moments when I'm alone? Will the figures come for me again, or have they moved on to someone else, someone who is foolish enough to go searching for the truth like I did? I don't know, but I do know this. The hospital is still there, buried beneath the surface of the city, its dark secrets still waiting to be uncovered. And I have no doubt that whoever walks through those doors next will be just as trapped as I was. So if you ever find yourself in that part of town, if you ever hear the faint echo of footsteps in an empty hallway, or if you catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of your eye, be careful. Don't go searching for answers. Some things are better left undisturbed. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that the strange occurrences of the night before were nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a combination of exhaustion and the unfamiliarity of my surroundings. But even as the day went on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. I had breakfast in the hotel lobby, trying to act normal, trying to enjoy the peace of the day. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the previous night. I found myself scanning the room constantly, as if waiting for something or someone to reveal itself. Each creak of the building, each rustle of paper from the front desk set my nerves on edge. By mid-afternoon, the tension inside me had reached a boiling point. I couldn't just sit idly by anymore. I needed to know what was happening, needed to get to the bottom of it. Was it the building? Was it me? There was no way I was going to leave without answers. I decided to go back to my room and inspect it more thoroughly. As soon as I walked through the door, a chill swept through the room, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air felt heavy, dense, almost suffocating. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that it was just my nerves, but the atmosphere in the room felt wrong. I walked over to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly to peek outside. The view was nothing special, just a narrow street lined with trees and the occasional passing car. But as I stood there, I noticed something strange. The trees outside seemed to move, not in a natural way, but almost as though they were swaying in sync with something just out of sight. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the movement didn't stop. It was as if the entire street had shifted, the trees bending in unnatural ways, their branches twisting and turning as if controlled by an invisible force. I stepped back, heart racing. This wasn't right. I shook my head, trying to clear the confusion clouding my thoughts. Maybe I had been awake too long, or maybe the light had played tricks on me. I decided to move on, to check the rest of the room. The bed was neatly made, just as I had left it, but the air felt different now, heavier. I turned toward the nightstand, my eyes scanning the room for any changes. It wasn't much, but one thing caught my eye. There was a small black feather on the floor near the corner of the room. I didn't recall seeing it before. I bent down to pick it up, running my fingers over its smooth surface, feeling a strange sensation wash over me. The feather was cold, colder than anything I had felt in the room, as though it had been outside in the snow. I stood up quickly, tossing it onto the nightstand and moving to the bathroom to check for anything unusual there. But there was nothing, just the same sterile tiles, the same worn towel hanging on the rack. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. My reflection seemed wrong. It wasn't that I looked different, but the way the light fell on me, my own image seemed to flicker, as though the mirror wasn't quite reflecting me properly. I froze, staring at my own face, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling once again. My reflection remained still, but the unease grew stronger. I reached out, my hand trembling, to touch the mirror. As my fingers made contact, I felt an odd sensation. It was like I wasn't touching glass at all, but something soft, something alive. I recoiled immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. I hurried out of the bathroom, wiping my hands on my pants. The room had become stifling, the walls closing in on me. I needed air. Desperately. I threw open the window, hoping the fresh air would clear my head, but as I did, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one in the room. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my breath shallow. My eyes darted around, scanning every corner of the room, but there was no one to be seen. The footsteps continued, though, echoing in the space between my ears. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like whoever was walking was standing right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I backed slowly toward the door, my hand outstretched toward the handle. Before I could reach it, the footsteps stopped. Just as suddenly as they had started, they ceased, and a cold wave of silence washed over me, leaving me trembling. I turned to leave the room, but as my hand touched the doorknob, I felt a sudden jolt, as if the entire room had shifted. The floor seemed to tilt slightly underfoot, and the walls pressed in tighter, as though the space itself was becoming smaller. I yanked the door open and stepped out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The hallway, thankfully, was empty, but the air in the building still felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was waiting just beyond the walls. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me, their hum adding to the tension. I took a few steps forward, trying to calm myself, but the hallway stretched on longer than I remembered, the walls seeming to close in as I walked. I decided I had to get answers. I couldn't keep going like this, jumping at every noise, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. I made my way down to the front desk, my footsteps quick and purposeful. The bellhop was there again, this time chatting with another guest. He looked up when I approached, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," I said, my voice more strained than I had intended. "Can you tell me anything about the history of this building? Anything unusual?" The bellhop blinked, his smile never wavering. "The hotel is quite old, sir. Built in the early 1900s. Some say it's haunted, but that's just the stories. Nothing to worry about." I nodded, trying to make sense of his words, but the more he spoke, the more unsettled I felt. The way he spoke, the way his eyes avoided mine, it all felt rehearsed, like he was trying to keep something hidden. "Have there been any incidents here? Any strange happenings?" The bellhop hesitated, his gaze shifting over my shoulder. "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir. Just your usual rumors. It's all part of the charm of an old building like this." I could tell he wasn't going to say anything more. I thanked him and left, my mind racing. Something wasn't right, and I needed to find out what it was before it was too late. I spent the rest of the afternoon roaming the halls, my eyes darting around every corner, every shadow, every flicker of light. There were no more footsteps, no more strange sounds, but the air in the building felt thick with anticipation, as if something was waiting to happen. When evening came, I made my way back to my room. The closer I got, the more the tension in my chest grew. Every step felt like I was walking towards something I couldn't see, but could sense all too well. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, my senses on high alert. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was wrong. The air felt colder, the shadows deeper. The room seemed to have changed, subtly but unmistakably. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. Only this time, they were not behind me. They were in front of me, walking toward me. As I stood frozen in the center of the room, the footsteps grew louder, their rhythm deliberate and unmistakable. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned slowly, every muscle in my body trembling with a primal fear I couldn't explain. I felt a bead of cold sweat slip down my back, the temperature in the room dropping drastically. It was as though the air itself was growing thick, heavy, suffocating. I glanced toward the door, contemplating running, but the sound of those footsteps. They were right behind me now. Every time I tried to turn around, it was as if the room shifted, subtly distorting my perception of the space around me. I couldn't escape. My feet felt glued to the floor. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow, the oppressive silence stretching out for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I mustered the courage to spin around, hoping to face whatever was causing the sounds, but my eyes only found the dim corner of the room. The shadows had grown darker, like tendrils of darkness creeping across the walls. The air seemed to vibrate with a sense of anticipation. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, slow and deliberate, its movements unnatural, as though it was gliding rather than walking. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, maybe a reflection from the mirror or a trick of the light. But no, it was real. The figure stepped fully into view, and my blood ran cold. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by a dark, tattered cloak that seemed to blend into the shadows themselves. Its face was hidden, shrouded in darkness, with nothing but empty space where its eyes should have been. The air around it seemed to warp, distorting the light as if it didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was no logical explanation. I could feel my pulse racing, my chest tightening with panic. The figure continued to advance, and as it did, I noticed the faintest whisper, a soft, almost inaudible murmur, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. It wasn't coming from the figure itself, but from the room, from the walls, from the very fabric of the building. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Every inch of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure raised its hand, an unnatural, jerking movement, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. The room felt like it was closing in around me, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lowering. My thoughts became muddled, fragmented. The only thing I could focus on was that presence, that suffocating weight in the room. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It wasn't spoken aloud, but inside my mind. The voice was deep, hollow, like the sound of a distant echo in a cavern. "You should not have stayed." The words reverberated inside my skull, sending a shockwave of terror through my body. I gasped, but no sound came out. I tried to move, tried to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. The figure took another step forward, and the darkness seemed to reach out toward me, drawing me closer to the unknown. The temperature in the room plummeted further, the chills sinking deep into my bones. I could feel the weight of it, like the very air was thick with the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting for a long time. I couldn't escape. My vision blurred as the room seemed to stretch, twisting and warping, and I felt a distinct sensation of being pulled into the shadows, into the darkness that surrounded me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure stopped. The room went silent. The footsteps, the whispering, the tension, all of it ceased in an instant. I stood there, trembling, my body racked with fear, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The figure remained in the shadows, motionless, its presence still looming in the room, heavy and suffocating. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, like a drumbeat echoing through the silence. Then, without warning, the figure spoke again. This time, the voice was louder, more forceful, and it was unmistakably coming from the figure itself. The words scraped against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. "You are not meant to be here." A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled backward, collapsing onto the bed. My body was trembling uncontrollably now, my thoughts racing, trying to make sense of everything. I couldn't understand it. None of it made sense. I closed my eyes, desperate to block out the presence of the figure, desperate to shut out the overwhelming sense of dread that consumed me. But when I opened my eyes again, the figure was still there, and it was closer. Much closer. It reached out a hand, long skeletal fingers, each one impossibly thin, stretched toward me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, constricted, as if I had no voice left. The figure's hand hovered just inches from my face, its cold breath washing over me, making my skin crawl. For a moment, everything went black. A deep, suffocating blackness swallowed me whole, and I felt as though I were falling into an abyss, a void that had no end. The darkness pressed in on all sides, crushing me until I could no longer breathe. And then, just as suddenly, the blackness was gone. I was back in the room. The figure was gone. The air had returned to normal. The temperature, the sounds, everything felt ordinary again. But I couldn't move. I couldn't process what had just happened. I sat there in the bed, staring at the empty space where the figure had stood, my mind reeling from the encounter. My chest was still tight, my breath shallow. My body was shaking uncontrollably, as though it had been through something traumatic, something beyond my comprehension. And yet, there was no one around to explain it, no one to tell me what had just happened. I finally stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. My mind was still in a fog, trying to make sense of the impossible. But as I moved toward the door, I caught a glimpse of the mirror once again. This time, there was no flickering reflection. But in the stillness of the room, the reflection of the door, the reflection of myself, shifted. and I could have sworn I saw a figure standing behind me, just out of sight. This happened to me a few years ago, and to this day, it's not something I talk about much, but I've decided to share it with you tonight. I had just finished a long business trip in a city I was not familiar with. You know, one of those trips where you're constantly moving from one meeting to another, with only a few hours of downtime to catch your breath. I'd been working non-stop, and by the end of the trip, I was beyond exhausted. It was nearing midnight when I finally found myself standing in the lobby of an older, rather unremarkable hotel, looking forward to the comfort of a bed. The bellhop, a man who seemed to be around my age, but wore an oddly formal uniform for such a small place, had greeted me with a quick nod. I didn't think much of it at the time. He handed me my room key, and I thanked him before heading to the elevator. The building had that faint, aged smell to it, the kind that clings to old carpets and creaky wooden doors. It wasn't unpleasant, but it certainly gave the hotel an air of antiquity. As the elevator doors closed, I let out a deep sigh, glad to be away from the chaos of the city for a few hours. The ride to the third floor was smooth enough, and when the doors opened, I stepped into a dimly lit hallway. The only light came from a few flickering bulbs on the ceiling, casting long shadows along the cracked wallpaper. There was no sound, save for the distant hum of the building's old air conditioning system. I didn't think anything of it. It was late, and I was tired. I made my way down the hall. The carpet beneath my feet muffled the sound of my footsteps, and reached my room at the end. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stepped inside, feeling the cool air of the room hit me. It was small, just a bed, a desk, and a worn-out armchair by the window. The walls were covered in a faded floral wallpaper, which didn't exactly scream luxury, but it was enough to make me feel at ease. I tossed my suitcase on the bed and took a moment to survey the room. Everything seemed normal. A little dated, perhaps, but nothing out of the ordinary. I quickly went about my usual routine, unpacked my things, hung up my jacket, and set the alarm on my phone for an early morning. By this point, I was so exhausted that I barely noticed the soft click of the door as it closed behind me when I went to the bathroom. When I returned, I found my bag moved a little, as if someone had slightly adjusted it on the bed. It was odd, but I assumed I must have moved it when I tossed it down earlier. But deep down, there was this uncomfortable, nagging feeling I couldn't shake off. I shrugged it off as a byproduct of exhaustion. There I was, standing in the middle of this dimly lit room, trying to shake off my thoughts and convince myself to get some sleep. I slid under the covers and turned off the bedside lamp. The silence in the room was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the building. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of my own breathing fill the air. For a moment, everything was peaceful. But then, just as I began to drift off, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, the faintest rustling, as if something was shifting around the room. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears in the dark. But the noise stopped. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind, or the old building settling. My mind raced through possibilities, but all of them seemed far-fetched. I decided it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It wasn't like anything out of the ordinary had happened. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I woke up in the middle of the night, the unsettling feeling from earlier still gnawing at me. The room was dark, too dark. The kind of darkness that feels heavier than usual. It took me a few seconds to gather my bearings, but when I did, I could feel my heart rate pick up. There was something wrong, though I couldn't quite place it. At first, I thought it was just my mind still adjusting to being away from home. The quiet, the unfamiliar surroundings, they all made me anxious, and my imagination could sometimes get the better of me. But this wasn't the kind of unease that fades with a deep breath. It was more than that. I reached over to the bedside table to check the time on my phone, and as I did, I noticed something strange. The lamp, which I was certain I had turned off before going to bed, was glowing faintly. Not the warm, inviting glow of a nightlight, but a pale, almost ghostly way. It was just enough to illuminate the room without being blinding. The soft light seemed to bleed into the corners of the room, creating shadows that felt longer than they should have been. I blinked, not entirely sure if I was still dreaming. Maybe I had turned the lamp on again without realizing it. But that wasn't the case. I distinctly remembered turning it off. And yet, there it was, faintly glowing in the dark. I sat up, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone come in while I was asleep? The thought made me freeze. The idea of someone sneaking into my room while I was unconscious sent a chill down my spine. But I immediately dismissed it. This was a hotel, after all. The staff wouldn't do something like that. Or at least, I hoped they wouldn't. I decided to get up and check the lamp to reassure myself that everything was fine. My feet hit the cold carpet, sending a jolt through my body. I walked over to the lamp and reached for the switch, flicking it off. The light immediately died, and the room returned to its previous darkness. For a moment, I stood there, just staring at the spot where the lamp had been. Everything felt normal again, or at least as normal as it had been a few minutes ago. I could feel my heart slowing, the tension in my body easing. I shook my head, telling myself that I was just tired, that my mind had created a problem where none existed. I returned to the bed, crawled back under the covers, and tried to fall back to sleep. But that's when I noticed it again, the faint rustling sound. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the soft scrape of fabric against fabric. But this time, it came from the corner of the room, near the window. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, a presence in the room, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My body went rigid, and I stayed perfectly still, my ears straining to hear. The sound didn't stop, it continued, growing just loud enough to become noticeable, like something or someone was shifting around. My mind raced. Could it be the wind? I tried to dismiss the thought, but it didn't feel like the wind. The sound wasn't constant or even natural. It was almost as if something or someone was moving around the room, testing the space. I turned my head toward the window, the cold air brushing across my skin. The curtains were still, but something about them seemed off. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though they were slightly drawn back, as if someone had peeked through them while I slept. My breath caught in my throat, and I found myself staring at the curtains, unable to look away. The rustling stopped, leaving behind a silence so thick it seemed to weigh on my chest. I couldn't decide whether that made it worse or not. But just when I thought I might be imagining things, I saw it, a brief flicker of movement. A shadow, barely visible, danced across the edge of the curtains. That's when the fear hit me, real, raw fear. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but something in the room didn't belong. Something was here, something I couldn't explain. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling slightly, and texted the front desk. My message was simple, but my heart was racing. Is anyone else staying on this floor tonight? The response came almost immediately. Yes, sir. You're the only guest on the 3rd floor. Enjoy your stay. The room seemed to close in around me as I processed their message. My mind began to spin, my heart pounding in my chest. I was the only guest on the floor. Then who or what was making the noise? And what had I seen? The shadow that had moved so quickly across the curtain? My mind told me it was just a trick of the light, that it was nothing more than my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I needed to get out of that room, or at the very least, I needed to make sure I wasn't going crazy. I grabbed my jacket and my phone, then made my way to the door, careful not to look back at the spot by the window. When I stepped into the hallway, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight on my chest begin to lift, if only slightly. The hallway was still, the same dim lights, the same quiet hum of the building settling. But the eerie feeling lingered. I walked down the hall to the stairwell, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached the lobby, the same bellhop from earlier was standing by the counter, looking up at me with an unreadable expression. Is everything okay, sir? He asked, his tone polite, but with a touch of curiosity. I wasn't sure what to say. I could barely process the situation, let alone explain it to him. I don't know, I muttered. There's something strange in my room. The bellhop nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. If you'd like, I can move you to another room. I wanted to say yes, to leave the unsettling room behind and find peace. But something held me back. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if something truly was happening. But the look in the bellhop's eyes, the way he was standing there, made me second guess everything. It was as though he already knew exactly what I was talking about. Instead of answering him, I just nodded and turned toward the door. It'll be fine. Just need some air. I stepped outside into the night, the cool breeze hitting my face and making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But as I stood there, trying to calm my thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped it, whatever it was. That night, I barely slept. The events of the evening looped in my mind over and over again, each time getting darker and more unsettling. I couldn't wait to leave the hotel the next morning. But little did I know, this was just the beginning. The sound of my own breathing was deafening in the silence that followed the disappearance of the figure. I couldn't think straight, I couldn't process what had just happened. Everything felt wrong, like the room itself had been changed by whatever presence had just been there. A dark, oppressive weight lingered, suffocating the air around me. I stumbled to the door, my legs shaky beneath me as I reached for the handle. The chill in the room had not dissipated, and the shadows still seemed to cling to the corners, lurking in the periphery of my vision. I didn't know if I was seeing things or if it was real, but I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I had to leave. With one last, hesitant glance around, I yanked the door open and stepped out into the hallway. The air felt warmer here, more familiar, but the sense of unease didn't fade. It was as if I was still tethered to that room, like I had never truly left. I looked down the hallway, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the situation. Was it all in my head? Was it a nightmare? Or had I truly encountered something beyond explanation? I made my way down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, my heart pounding in my chest. The hall was eerily quiet, devoid of any life, as though the whole place was holding its breath. Every corner I turned, I half expected to see the figure standing there, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me, even though there was nothing in sight. I reached the staircase and descended quickly, the sense of urgency making my every step feel heavier. The exit couldn't come soon enough. I just needed to get out of there, to breathe fresh air again. I had to leave the hotel, to leave that cursed room and everything it had unleashed behind me. When I finally pushed open the door to the outside, the cold night air hit me like a wave, sharp and biting. The world outside was dark, but it felt like freedom compared to the stifling atmosphere inside the hotel. I walked away from the entrance, my pace quickening with every step, my eyes constantly darting over my shoulder. But there was nothing. Nothing but the distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of streetlights in the night. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. For the next few days, I tried to put the whole experience out of my mind. I went back to my routine, to the mundane distractions of daily life, but nothing felt the same. The memory of that night, of the figure in the room, lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. I could still feel its presence, like it was waiting, watching, waiting for the right moment to reappear. It wasn't just in my thoughts, it started to creep into my dreams too. The same oppressive darkness, the same unnerving footsteps echoing in the stillness. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the weight of fear pressing down on me, only to realize I was in my own bed. But even then, the fear didn't go away. It clung to me, tightening around my chest, like something I couldn't shake off, no matter how hard I tried. I tried to tell myself that I had been imagining things, that it had all been a product of stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had seen something that defied explanation. I had felt it. I dug deeper and found something even more chilling. There had been stories of people who stayed in that room, the same room I had occupied, who never checked out. They were never seen again, their names lost to time. The hotel had tried to cover it up, of course, but there were whispers, rumors of a curse that haunted the place, passed down from one guest to the next. It seemed that the room I had stayed in had a dark history of its own. No one really knew why, but it was said that whoever stayed there was marked. It was as if the room itself had a mind of its own, seeking out those who would dare to spend a night within its walls. I couldn't help but wonder if it was the room itself that had been watching me, waiting for me to step into its grasp. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that the figure, the shadowy presence I had encountered, might not have been a person at all. It could have been the room itself, the dark force that lingered there, feeding on fear, on the energy of those trapped within it. And that thought terrified me more than anything. The room wasn't just haunted. It was alive. As much as I wanted to leave it all behind, I knew that I would never be the same. The hotel, the room, the figure, it had all left its mark on me. I would never forget what I saw, what I felt. It would stay with me, lurking in the corners of my mind, just as it had in the corners of that room. The worst part was, I wasn't sure I'd be able to escape it. There were days when I'd walk through a darkened hallway or catch a glimpse of a shadow in my peripheral vision, and for a brief moment, I would freeze, convinced that I was back in that room, that the figure was there, waiting. I could never be sure if it was real or just my imagination running wild. But the fear was always there, just beneath the surface. The truth was, I hadn't really escaped. The room wasn't just a place, it was a memory. And no matter how far I ran, I would never truly be free from it. The shadows had followed me, and I knew, deep down, that they always would. As the days passed, the weight of the experience seemed to settle deeper within me. The fear, the unease, it wasn't something that just faded away. It wasn't something that could simply be forgotten. The hotel, that room, and the figure, I couldn't escape them. They had etched themselves into the very fabric of my being, and no matter how hard I tried to move on, they clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. I tried to go back to my normal life, but it wasn't the same. I couldn't sit still without feeling that sense of dread creeping back into my thoughts. It was as if I were always looking over my shoulder, waiting for something I couldn't name. I hadn't seen the figure since I left the hotel, but I felt it, its presence, always just out of sight, always there in the back of my mind. It was when I sat down to think about everything that had happened that the full weight of the experience hit me. The truth was, it wasn't just about the hotel or the room. It was about how deeply I had been affected by it, how it had changed me. I wasn't the same person I had been before that night. I had walked into that hotel expecting a simple stay, a place to rest. But I had walked out with something much more profound, a sense of vulnerability, of being small in the face of something far beyond my understanding. It wasn't just the fear of what I had encountered, but the realization that there were things in this world, things we can't see or explain, that hold power over us. We live our lives, going about our business, assuming that we have control over our surroundings. But sometimes there are forces we can't touch, forces that exist beyond our understanding. And when they make themselves known, it's not just the terror of the unknown that strikes us. It's the realization that we are nothing more than helpless observers in the face of something far larger than ourselves. I still remember the moment I stood outside the hotel, looking back at its dark, looming structure. I had thought that leaving it behind meant I could forget, that I could move on and never look back. But that was a lie. You can't leave something like that behind. Once it touches you, it stays with you. The hotel may have been a physical place, but the fear, the darkness, it's something that travels with you, invisible but ever present. I had thought that running away from the hotel meant escaping the nightmare. But I learned the hard way that nightmares don't end when you wake up. They follow you, they stick to you, they burrow into your thoughts and twist your perception of reality. The feeling that something was watching, waiting, never truly left me. I would be walking through the streets, surrounded by people, yet still feel that same cold sense of isolation, that same oppressive atmosphere that had consumed me in that room. And as the weeks passed, I found myself questioning everything. What had I really experienced that night? Was it some trick of the mind, a result of exhaustion or stress? Or had I truly encountered something that could not be explained by any logical means? There were no answers, no neat conclusions. The only certainty was that something had happened, something beyond the realm of the normal and the explainable. The questions lingered, unresolved, leaving me with a sense of unease that never fully went away. And so, I sit here now, reflecting on everything that happened. The hotel is gone, a place I'll never return to. The figure is gone, or so I hope. But the fear, the awareness of something beyond this world, it's still here. It's in the corners of my mind, in the quiet moments when I let my guard down and the weight of the past creeps in. I've come to realize that we all carry some darkness with us, something that we can't shake off, no matter how hard we try. It's a part of who we are, whether we acknowledge it or not. And as much as we might want to run from it, to bury it in the past, it always seems to find a way to catch up with us. Maybe that's the real horror, the knowledge that no matter where we go, no matter how far we run, we can never escape what haunts us. So here I am, still haunted, still unsure of what really happened, but knowing that it will never truly leave me. Maybe that's the price we pay for dabbling in the unknown, for stepping into places where we don't belong. We come back changed, and no amount of distance or time can undo it. In the end, I wonder, does anyone truly escape what they fear most? Or do we all carry our nightmares with us, locked inside, until the day we're forced to face them once again? It was just another regular day in the sleepy little town where I lived. A place so quiet, you could hear the wind sweep through the streets like it was whispering to itself. I remember the air was a little heavier that afternoon, as though the weather knew something was going to happen. It wasn't unusual, though things like that are common here, where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the days tend to blur together. The town was surrounded by dense forest on all sides, a sprawling wilderness that stretched out beyond what could be seen from the town square. We all grew up hearing stories about that forest, tales passed down by generations that had lived in the town for as long as anyone could remember. There were whispers of odd occurrences, strange disappearances, and eerie feelings that would settle over the land at night. But they were just stories, right? Nothing more than old superstitions that people like to talk about at night. I'd heard it all before, but I never gave it much thought. I was the kind of person who needed more than just a tale to believe in something. My friends and I would joke about the haunted woods, making up our own versions of the legend, but we never ventured in there. It was enough for us to stay at the edge and look at it from a distance, feeling the chill that crept over the town each time the forest got mentioned. It wasn't until one of my usual hikes, the kind I did every weekend, that I found myself standing at the entrance of the forest. Something had drawn me there, an almost magnetic pull that I couldn't explain. It wasn't my first time walking the trails, but this time there was something different in the air. I should have turned back when I saw it, but instead I felt the urge to push forward. I had always loved the outdoors, hiking, camping, exploring the quiet corners of the world where I could clear my mind. That was my routine. It was how I escaped the noise of daily life. On that day, The sun was setting just behind the tree line, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. I had a backpack with water, snacks, and a camera, the usual things anyone would carry for a short hike. My plan was simple: explore a little, snap a few pictures, then head back before dark. The town had always felt safe, familiar, even comforting. But as I stepped onto the worn path that led into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something much more than just a hike. The air shifted, and though I couldn't see it, I could feel the eyes of the trees watching me. The deeper I walked, the more intense the silence became. It wasn't the peaceful silence I was used to from the open trails near town. This was different. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My footsteps echoed in the distance, and I started to notice that there was no wildlife, no birds, no squirrels. Just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to settle around me like a cloak. There was a strange allure to it, though, a pull that kept me moving deeper. The further I went, the more the trees closed in on me, their twisted branches reaching overhead like the fingers of some unseen hand. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, but I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, nothing more. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the impression that something was there, just beyond the edge of my vision. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, felt like it was being observed. But I pushed on, determined to finish my hike. I thought of the stories, the legends, but they seemed distant, as though they were someone else's fears and not my own. I told myself I wasn't one to buy into such superstitions. But still, I couldn't ignore the unease that began to creep in. By the time I reached a small clearing deep in the woods, I felt like something had changed. The atmosphere was heavier now, as though the air itself was saturated with something I couldn't understand. I took a few pictures of the open space in front of me, trying to capture the moment, but something in the back of my mind told me I needed to leave. There was an old log in the middle of the clearing, as though it had been placed there deliberately. And that's when I noticed something that I hadn't before, an old worn sign half buried beneath the dirt and leaves. It looked ancient, its wood darkened by years of neglect. I approached it slowly, brushing off the dirt, and as I read the faded letters, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the words that struck me, though. It was the date, carved into the wood, beneath the faded message. It was a date long before my time, before the town had even been founded. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at the sign. Something about it felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to leave. The pull that had brought me deeper into the woods now felt like a warning. And in that moment, I knew I had to get back to the safety of the town before it was too late. But as I turned to leave, I heard something, a voice, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper, but it was the kind of sound that gripped you from the inside, a chill that seemed to freeze you in place. My heart raced as I spun around, looking for the source. But there was nothing there, nothing but the forest, empty and still. I quickly gathered my things, my pulse pounding in my ears, and made my way back to the path, retracing my steps. I had to get out of there, and fast. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was trying to hold me there, to keep me from leaving. I don't know what I was running from, but I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw the familiar sights of the town ahead. My heart was still racing, and the weight on my chest refused to lift. I didn't know what had happened in that forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. It had just begun. The days following my hike through the forest were uneventful. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. The town felt as it always had, quiet, peaceful, and removed from the chaos of the world. But something was different now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. It was an odd sensation, like a weight pressing on my chest, subtle yet constant. I chalked it up to nerves from venturing into the forest, telling myself I had simply let the old stories get to me. But that all changed one evening. It was a Tuesday, just another evening after work. I was sitting on my porch, the cool air of early autumn settling in around me as I enjoyed the fading light of the setting sun. The town was quiet, as it always was, with only the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional car passing by to break the silence. I had been trying to push the events of my hike to the back of my mind, but the feeling of unease kept creeping back in. I tried to focus on the small things, like the steady hum of my neighbor's old truck as it started up in the driveway, but it didn't help. It was then that I noticed something strange. Across the street, near the edge of the woods, there was a figure standing just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it might be someone taking a walk, or perhaps someone lost in thought, standing still in the fading light. But as I stared, I realized there was something off about it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, blending into the shadows of the forest. For a moment, I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me, the fading light distorting everything. But no, the figure was still there. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the strange sensation that had crept up my spine. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It was too dark for someone to be standing in the trees without moving, without any sound or sign of life. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a trick of my mind, but I couldn't look away. Then, without warning, the figure shifted. It didn't move like a person. It didn't seem to walk or step forward. It simply changed position in the way shadows sometimes stretch across the ground as the sun sets. One moment, it was standing by the trees, and the next, it was farther into the woods, further out of sight. But it wasn't a normal motion. There was no gradual movement. It was as if the figure had simply vanished and reappeared somewhere else. My heart skipped a beat. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to tell myself that I was overthinking things. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain what I had just seen, and that made the feeling of dread all the more real. My hands trembled slightly as I stood up from the porch swing and stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. I leaned against the door for a moment, my mind racing. Maybe it had been nothing, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I tried to push it aside as I grabbed a drink from the fridge, but the thought of the figure stayed with me. It clung to me like a shadow of its own, hanging over every action, every moment. I couldn't explain why, but I had the distinct feeling that whatever I had seen, if I had seen anything at all, was not a coincidence. It was as though it was connected to the forest in some way, connected to something that I had unwittingly disturbed when I ventured too far into its depths. Later that night, as I sat on the couch with a book in my lap, the unease began to grow. The stillness in the air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I kept hearing noises, soft tapping sounds at the window, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. But when I glanced up, there was nothing there. The streetlights cast long shadows across the yard, and everything was as it should be. Or so I thought. A low, faint knocking sound echoed from the window again, this time louder, more distinct. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the front of the house, from the direction of the porch. I approached the window cautiously, my breath caught in my throat, and peered through the curtains. My heart froze in my chest. There, standing on my front porch, was the figure again. At first, I couldn't make out any details. The figure was too dark against the night, the shadows from the trees and the porch light playing tricks on my eyes. I leaned closer to the window, my palms pressing against the cool glass, trying to get a better look. It was the same figure, but now it was standing directly in front of the porch door, unmoving, silent. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. I wanted to go outside and confront whatever or whoever was out there, but fear held me in place. I thought about calling the police, but the figure wasn't doing anything but standing there. There was no sign of aggression, no indication that it meant harm. Still, I couldn't shake the gut-wrenching feeling that something was wrong. I backed away from the window, feeling the cold sweat form on the back of my neck. It wasn't until I turned to head back into the living room that I noticed something else. the faintest trace of something on the window pane, something that hadn't been there before. It was a handprint, the outline of a hand pressed against the glass, its fingers leaving an imprint in the condensation from the night air. The hand was small, too small to be an adult's, and the edges were blurry, as if it had been left there only moments before. I stood frozen, my mind racing. There was no way it could have been mine. I hadn't been anywhere near the window, let alone pressed my hand against it. The imprint was cold to the touch, like it had been there far longer than I had realized. Panic started to settle in, and I rushed to lock all the doors and windows, my hands shaking as I tried to secure every entryway. I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't explain, a fear so intense that it felt like something was closing in on me. I sat on the couch, unable to tear my eyes from the window, waiting for the figure to reappear, to reveal its intentions. But it didn't. The night stretched on, quiet and uneventful, though the air felt different, charged with a strange energy. The figure on my porch had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just some strange coincidence, maybe a prank. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had followed me from the forest, and it wasn't going to let me forget it. The night passed in a blur of restless thoughts and nervous glances at every window. I didn't sleep much, and when morning finally came, I thought about everything, the figure, the handprint, the way the air had felt thick and heavy around me. And I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. It had just begun. The next few days were a blur of restlessness, the eerie feeling from that night creeping into every part of my life. It wasn't just the unsettling figure anymore, it was everything. The atmosphere around me had changed. My once peaceful home now felt suffocating, like something was lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. I tried to go on as if everything was normal, to put the strange events behind me and get back to my routine. But every night, as darkness settled in, that feeling returned. It wasn't just the noise I had heard, those faint, almost imperceptible taps at the window, but an overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. The quiet outside my house seemed too still, like the world was holding its breath. I couldn't escape it. It started small at first. At night, you'd hear a creaking sound coming from the attic, like footsteps moving across the floorboards. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old houses make strange sounds after all. But the creaking continued, and then came the scratching. Soft, almost inaudible, like something, or someone, was dragging its nails across the wooden beams above me. I'd get up to investigate, but every time I did, there was nothing there. Just silence. The strange occurrences didn't end with the house. It was as if the forest itself was drawing me in. Whenever I stepped outside, it glanced towards the tree line, and every time I would swear I saw movement in the shadows, something shifting just beyond my view. But when I focused, there was nothing there. No one walking, no animals stirring in the underbrush. Just trees swaying gently in the wind. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. Was it my imagination? Was I losing my mind? Or was there something out there, something far darker than I could comprehend, that had been following me since that day I ventured into the woods? One afternoon, I made the decision to go back to the forest. It was foolish, I knew that. But the strange pull, the nagging sense that I needed to return, was too strong to ignore. I packed a small bag with supplies, water, a flashlight, and a knife, just in case. It wasn't as if I thought the forest would be dangerous, but after everything that had happened, I wanted to be prepared for anything. The sun was beginning to set as I entered the woods, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It felt different now, oppressive, like something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for me to step too far into its domain. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest felt alive with quiet, unseen movement. The wind rustled through the trees, But there was something else, something beneath the natural sounds of the woods. It was faint at first, just a whisper of something following my steps. At first, I thought it was my imagination. After all, it was just a forest, filled with life, animals, birds, insects. But then it came again, more distinct this time. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, keeping pace with mine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I turned around quickly, but there was no one behind me. The forest was as still as it had been when I first entered, the only movement coming from the sway of the trees in the wind. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer or some other creature was moving through the underbrush behind me. But the more I listened, the more I realized that the footsteps sounded wrong. Too close, too deliberate. I didn't wait around to investigate. I pressed on, my steps quickening, my eyes darting nervously to the shadows at the edge of my vision. The deeper I went into the woods, the darker it became. The sun had almost disappeared entirely, and I could barely see the path ahead. The only light now came from the weak glow of my flashlight, which barely pierced the thick darkness around me. And then I heard it again. A voice! At first, it was so faint that I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a whisper, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time, just loud enough for me to make out a few words. Leave! It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was deep and guttural, filled with a raw, primal edge that sent a chill down my spine. It sounded almost like a command, and it was as if the words had been pulled directly from the forest itself. I froze again, heart pounding. I couldn't move, couldn't even bring myself to look around. It was as if the forest itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The air grew colder, and I felt an unnatural weight pressing down on me. The trees seemed to close in, the darkness around me growing thicker, suffocating. I wanted to turn back, to run as fast as I could, but I couldn't. My legs felt heavy, as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to stand there, rooted to the spot. And then I saw it. A figure. It appeared just beyond the reach of my flashlight, standing at the edge of the trees, its form barely visible in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark, shifting shape that seemed to blur with the shadows around it. But I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. It was watching me. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but my body refused to move. My heart raced in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat pooling on my skin. I knew I had to get away, but it was as if the forest itself was keeping me trapped, drawing me deeper into its twisted embrace. The voice came again, this time louder, more forceful. Leave now. This time, I couldn't ignore it. The force of the words hit me like a physical blow, and I snapped into motion. I spun around, running through the woods with no thought other than to escape, to get away from whatever it was that was pursuing me. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath my feet. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out. The voice followed me, now a chorus of whispers, all speaking at once, shouting commands, urging me to leave. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was right behind me, always just out of sight. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the woods, stumbling onto the familiar dirt road that led back to my house. The air was suddenly lighter, and I could hear the sounds of the night again, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant hum of cars passing by. But even as I caught my breath, I knew it wasn't over. The forest had made its presence known, and I wasn't sure if it'd ever be free of it. The whispers, the footsteps, the figure in the trees, they were all part of something far larger than I had ever imagined. And now I had to face the truth. Whatever was in that forest, whatever had been following me, wasn't done with me yet. It had been days since it returned from the forest, and the unease still clung to me like a second skin. My nights were sleepless, filled with restless tossing and turning, and even during the day, the sense that something was watching me never fully left. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, a reaction to the fear it felt out there. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something wasn't finished. I couldn't explain it, but the pull to return to the forest was growing stronger each day. It was as if the forest itself was calling to me, like an unseen force beckoning me back, deeper than before. I knew it was madness. I should have stayed away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, something important that I needed to understand, or risk losing myself to whatever was out there. I stood at the edge of the woods that evening, staring into the darkness between the trees, the thick underbrush obscuring the path. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, but the forest ahead was already cloaked in shadows. It looked different now, almost unnatural, like a living thing that was both beautiful and terrifying at once. Without thinking, I stepped forward. The ground beneath my boots was soft, and the air felt damp, as if the earth was holding on to the last remnants of the rain that had fallen days ago. I kept my flashlight tight in my grip, its beam cutting through the darkness. With each step I took, I felt the forest grow quieter, as if it was closing in on me. The sounds of wildlife, the birds, the rustling of leaves were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The path began to narrow, and I noticed something strange ahead. At first, it was just a faint flicker of light, like a distant flame. I thought it was a trick of the mind, perhaps the reflection of my own flashlight. But as I moved closer, the light grew brighter. It wasn't coming from the forest itself. It was something else. A faint glow in the distance, pulsating softly, like a heartbeat. Curiosity, and something darker, more primal, drove me forward. The light seemed to pull at me, urging me on. I had no idea what it was, but I couldn't ignore it. I pushed through the brush, my flashlight illuminating the twisted trunks of trees, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The glow ahead became stronger, clearer, until I could make out the outline of a small clearing up ahead. As I stepped into the clearing, the light was blinding, soft, but unnaturally so, as if it were coming from somewhere beyond the physical world. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the center of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, and cloaked in shadow, its form barely visible in the strange light. The figure seemed to be made of the very darkness itself, as if it were both part of the forest and separate from it. Its outline shimmered, flickering like a flame, and its presence filled the air with a heavy, suffocating energy. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure was watching me, its shape shifting and flickering, as if it were both real and unreal at the same time. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, the cold sweat on my skin making me feel even more exposed in its presence. It was then that I heard it, the voice. Not the whisper from before, but something much more powerful. A voice that seemed to resonate from the very air around me, its tone deep and commanding, yet filled with an eerie calm. "Why did you come back?" The words struck me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The question echoed in my mind, reverberating off the walls of the forest as if the trees themselves were listening. My mouth was dry, and my body trembled with fear. But the need for answers, for some kind of understanding, pushed me to speak. I need to know what's going on. What's been happening? Why? Why is this happening to me? The figure did not move, did not respond immediately. The light around it seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, each thrum of energy making the air feel heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that this was no ordinary encounter. This was something ancient, something beyond human understanding. It was as if the forest itself was alive, and this figure, whatever it was its heart, its soul. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and the figure shifted, its form becoming clearer, more solid, but still indistinct. It was as if the forest was consuming it, merging it with the shadows around us. And then the voice came again, only this time it was different, darker, more insistent. "You don't belong here. You never did." The words felt like a warning, but they also felt like an accusation. The weight of them settled on me, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. What did it mean? What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? I just want to understand, I whispered, my voice barely audible against the pounding of my heart. Please, tell me what's going on. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering my words. Then, slowly, it began to speak again. You are not the first to come here. Many have sought answers, only to find that the forest does not give them freely. It takes, and it never gives back. The air around me grew even colder, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, like the earth itself was alive and moving. I took a step back, but the figure's presence seemed to pull me forward again, its influence overwhelming. I could feel it now, the truth, raw and heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The forest wasn't just a place. It was something far older, far more powerful, and it had been watching me long before I set foot in it. It knew me. It had always known me. And that was when it hit me, what I had left behind. The realization slammed into me with the force of a freight train, and I gasped, my breath hitching in my throat. The forest hadn't been following me. It had been waiting for me to come back, to finish what I had started. As the figure's presence loomed larger, as the forest closed in around me, I knew that I had made a terrible mistake. There was no turning back. I had awoken something ancient and malevolent, and now it was ready to take its due. The final question burned in my mind, and I could barely form the words. What do you want from me? The figure's response was chilling, its voice low and ominous, as if it was both inside my mind and the world around me at the same time. Everything. I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. The figure loomed in front of me, its form shifting in and out of reality, its dark presence consuming the space around us. Everything, it had said. Its voice still echoed in my mind, a chilling whisper that made my skin crawl. The truth slammed into me harder than I could process. I had ventured too far into the forest, too deep into its heart, and now it was too late. This place, this cursed forest, wasn't just a patch of land. It was something far older, something that existed long before human feet ever tread on it. And I was never meant to be here. None of us were. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. It was fear, yes, but it was also something else, defiance. I couldn't just stand there, couldn't accept the idea that I was doomed to be consumed by this forest, by this malevolent presence. My legs shook, but I forced myself to take a step back, then another. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow more intense with each passing second. I had to get out. I had to leave. The forest wanted me, wanted my soul, my essence, everything. But I wasn't ready to give in. The sound of my breath was loud in my ears, mingling with the rustling of the trees, the whispers of something just out of reach. I stumbled over rocks and fallen branches, barely keeping my footing as the darkness seemed to stretch out before me. It was as if the forest had no end, no escape. But still I ran. I had to. I didn't look back, didn't dare to glance over my shoulder, even as I felt the weight of the forest pressing in on me. But as I neared the edge of the woods, the light from the moon shining through the trees, I heard something behind me, something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Not my own. They were too deliberate, too heavy, as if someone or something was following me, keeping pace with my frantic flight. My heart skipped a beat, and I increased my pace, my legs screaming with exhaustion, my breath ragged. But the footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. They were right there, just behind me, and I could almost feel the presence of whatever was chasing me. I pushed myself harder, but the trees seemed to grow taller, the path darker, more confusing. It was like the forest itself was playing tricks on me, twisting and turning, disorienting me, trapping me in its endless maze. I couldn't keep running forever. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was worse. It was like the world around me had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from falling into an abyss. I didn't stop running, but the sound of my footsteps now seemed to echo through the stillness, and with each step I took, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me. The clearing, the exit, was ahead. I could see it just a little further. The trees were thinning, and the night air felt less oppressive. With one final burst of energy, I broke through the trees, into the open field beyond. My heart was racing, my legs trembling beneath me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The forest was behind me now, at least for the moment, and I had made it out. But as I stood there, panting and dizzy, a sudden realization hit me. I wasn't free. The forest had let me go, but it hadn't released me, not fully. I staggered to my car, still trembling from the terror I had just experienced, and climbed inside. I didn't even bother to lock the doors. I just started the engine and drove. I needed to get as far away from that place as possible, but deep down, I knew I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't outrun whatever force had taken root in that forest. As I drove, the miles stretched between me and the forest, but the feeling never left. The dread, the uncertainty, the constant sense that something was watching me, it was with me now, wherever I went. It wasn't until I reached my apartment, the familiar walls offering a semblance of safety, that I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. I had escaped, but at what cost? The forest had shown me its true nature, its hunger, and I had barely managed to break free. The worst part, I wasn't sure if I had escaped at all. The forest's influence was still with me, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to pull me back. And so, I waited. I lived my life, but every sound, every rustle of wind, every strange movement out of the corner of my eye, it reminded me that the forest was still out there, and it was never going to let me go. I had been warned, but I hadn't listened. Now I was paying the price. There were no answers, no resolutions. The forest had left me with only questions. And the worst part of it all was that I didn't know if I would ever be free. Weeks passed since I fled from that cursed forest, yet the feeling of unease never truly left. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just fear, the kind that comes from surviving something so terrifying. But deep down, I knew that the forest hadn't let me go. It wasn't something I could shake off, no matter how hard I tried. Every night, the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that the forest had eyes, invisible but always present, following my every move. I couldn't step outside without hearing the rustling of leaves in the distance, the distant echoes of branches groaning under an unseen weight. No matter where I was, that place, that dreadful forest, loomed in the back of my mind, casting a long, dark shadow over my life. I found myself unable to sleep, my mind replaying every detail of that night, over and over. The footsteps behind me, the cold, otherworldly presence that had whispered its demands. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The figure, its shifting form, the haunting energy that pulsed through the forest like a living thing. It felt so real, so close, like I had never really left. I stopped going to the places I used to frequent. The trails I walked, the parks I visited, they all seemed too close to that cursed patch of land. I tried to tell myself I was being irrational, but every time I thought about the forest, my chest tightened and a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just a bad memory, it was a presence that lingered, unseen but palpable. The strangest part? I never really spoke about it to anyone. I couldn't. How could I explain what I had experienced? How could I make anyone believe that something so dark and unnatural was lurking just beyond the veil of our reality? I had no answers, only an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to follow me everywhere. And the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it grew. One night, several months later, I was sitting in my apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. The world outside looked so peaceful, so normal, but I knew better. I knew that peace was fragile, easily shattered. My mind drifted back to that night, the cold grip of terror that had taken hold of me, and the voice that had called my name. I had been foolish to think I could escape. The phone rang, breaking my thoughts, and I jumped, startled. I picked up the receiver and was greeted by a voice I hadn't heard in months. An old friend, someone I had shared many memories with before all of this began. He asked if I was okay, if everything was all right. I told him I was fine, but I wasn't. He pressed, asking why I hadn't been answering calls or returning messages. And that's when the truth started to spill out. I told him everything, the forest, the figure, the feeling that it was still there, following me, waiting. I spoke in fragments, the words tumbling out in a rush, the fear still raw in my voice. He didn't believe me. At first, he thought I was just having a rough time, maybe even hallucinating. But when I mentioned the strange things I had noticed, small, unexplainable things that kept happening, he hesitated. He seemed to know that something was off. I didn't know whether that made things better or worse. I sat in silence after we hung up, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. I was relieved to have said it out loud, but at the same time, a sense of dread settled deeper in my chest. Talking about it hadn't made it go away. It only brought it back into sharper focus. The forest, the figure, the darkness, it was all still there, lurking beneath the surface, just waiting to return. And then came the phone call that shook me to my core. It was a few days after I spoke to my friend. He sounded frantic, out of breath, as if he had been running. "I've been out to that forest," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't believe you, but I should have." There was a pause, a sound of something crashing in the background. "It's real, man. Whatever you saw, it's real, and it's not letting me go." It's not letting any of us go. The phone line went dead. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I rushed outside, panic gripping me. I drove back to the town, to the place where the forest stood. I didn't know what I was looking for, what I could possibly do. I didn't even know if I could face it again. As I neared the edge of the forest, I felt a familiar chill settle in the air. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I parked the car and stepped out, my legs unsteady beneath me. I walked slowly toward the trees, the sense of dread growing with every step. But this time, it was different. There was no figure waiting for me in the shadows, no eerie whispers floating on the breeze. It was silent, unnervingly silent. I walked deeper into the forest, but something didn't feel right. The trees seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. My breath quickened, and I found myself unable to move, rooted to the spot, just like that night. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, not mine, echoing through the woods. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, just running, the sound of the footsteps growing louder in my ears. The air felt thick, suffocating, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I never looked back again, and I don't know if I ever will.